Inattentional blindness exploitation. Inattentional blindness exploitation is the unsettling manipulation of a fundamental flaw in human perception, the brain's tendency to miss what it isn't actively looking for. It is the phenomenon where someone becomes so focused on one detail, one task, or one emotional state that they become blind to everything else happening around them. What makes this so disturbing is not the blindness itself, but how easily it can be triggered and how profoundly it can shape a person's reality without them ever noticing. When someone's attention is narrowed, the mind creates the illusion of awareness, leaving them confident that they're perceiving the full picture even as critical information slips past unnoticed. This vulnerability becomes dangerous when used to divert awareness at the exact moment something important occurs. People under emotional stress, excitement, confusion, or urgency become the easiest targets because their attention naturally collapses inward. A person overwhelmed by information or fixated on a single emotional cue can fail to notice contradictions, missing details, or even obvious red flags in front of them. The haunting part is that inattentional blindness doesn't feel like blindness, it feels like clarity. The brain fills in the gaps with assumptions, memories, and expectations, creating the sensation of understanding while actually filtering away reality itself. Manipulators often rely on moments of distraction, urgency, or emotional overload to hide their true intentions in plain sight. Knowing the mind cannot fully track multiple layers of meaning at once, recognizing when your attention is being pulled too sharply in one direction becomes the only defense against the invisible shadows that form in the corners of your awareness. Change blindness manipulation. Change blindness manipulation exploits a deeply unnerving flaw in the human mind, our inability to notice alterations in our environment, even when those changes unfold right before our eyes. The brain, always desperate to preserve mental energy, assumes stability unless something violently demands attention. This assumption becomes a vulnerability the moment someone deliberately shifts details, replaces information, or alters a narrative while your focus is elsewhere. What makes change blindness so disturbing is how confidently the mind insists that nothing has changed, even when the entire situation has quietly rearranged itself beneath your awareness. When someone is emotionally engaged, stressed, or cognitively overloaded, their brain clings to its first impression as if it were a lifeline. Small changes slip through the cracks, expressions that harden for a moment, stories that subtly shift, promises that morph into something unrecognizable. People don't detect these alterations because their mind wants coherence more than accuracy. It patches over inconsistencies, smoothing them out until the original and altered versions blend together as one unquestioned memory. Manipulators can exploit this by making gradual modifications that rely on the victim's brain to overlook each step. What begins as a tiny adjustment can accumulate into an entirely different reality, yet the person affected rarely notices the transition. They simply wake up one day feeling that something is off without being able to trace when it began. The most unsettling aspect is not the manipulation itself, but the realization that your brain can betray you quietly, confidently, and without hesitation, allowing someone else to rewrite parts of your world while you remain convinced nothing has changed at all. Visual crowding overload. Visual crowding overload is the psychological breach created when the brain becomes overwhelmed by dense, competing visual stimuli, forcing it to abandon clarity in favor of crude guesses and blurred assumptions. In busy, chaotic environments, the mind simply cannot separate one object from another and instead fuses them into a distorted impression that feels real but is dangerously incomplete. This vulnerability becomes terrifying when you realize how easily someone can manipulate what you notice and what you fail to see just by surrounding key details with noise, movement, or clutter. When the visual field is overloaded, the brain panics quietly. It tries to simplify the scene, discarding important information in the process. A crucial object can be hidden in plain sight by placing it among similar shapes, conflicting patterns, or rapid distractions. A lie can be disguised by burying it in excessive text. A subtle gesture, expression, or switch can occur right in front of someone who will swear they saw everything. Crowding doesn't just blur vision, it blurs awareness itself. This kind of overload becomes even more potent when paired with emotional pressure. Under stress, urgency, or uncertainty, the mind narrows its focus to the most dominant visual cues while ignoring everything else, making it effortless for someone to guide your gaze where they want it and conceal what they don't want you to notice. The unsettling part is how confident people feel in their perception, even as their brain silently deletes half the scene, leaving them vulnerable to illusions crafted not through skill, but through overwhelming the senses until clarity collapses. Peripheral attention hijacking. Peripheral attention hijacking is the quiet exploitation of the brain's habit of scanning the edges of vision for movement, threat, or emotional cues long before these signals reach conscious awareness. The human mind is hardwired to monitor the periphery as an ancient survival mechanism, constantly evaluating flickers, shifts, and subtle gestures that might indicate danger. But this instinct becomes a vulnerability the moment someone deliberately uses peripheral cues to guide, distract, or influence your focus without ever engaging you directly. The unsettling part is that the brain reacts to these signals automatically, often faster than conscious thought, allowing an outside force to shape your attention without your permission. When something moves or changes at the edge of vision, the mind instinctively responds. Your focus tightens or shifts, your awareness narrows, and your judgment subtly recalibrates. Manipulators can exploit this by creating calculated distractions just outside your central focus. Small gestures, sudden shifts, deliberate micro-movements designed to pull your attention away from what truly matters. While your conscious mind believes it is making rational decisions, your subconscious is being tugged in the exact direction someone else wants you to look. This technique becomes even more potent when emotional tension is involved. Under stress or uncertainty, the brain becomes hypersensitive to peripheral cues, amplifying their influence. A simple glance, a slight head turn, or the movement of an object can redirect your awareness without you ever realizing it. The haunting truth is that most people trust what they see, yet the periphery can be manipulated to steer perception, leaving you vulnerable to distractions carefully crafted to slip beneath conscious detection. Salience hijacking. Salience hijacking is the calculated takeover of your brain's instinctive urge to notice whatever appears most important, urgent, or emotionally charged in a given moment. The mind is built to latch onto anything that stands out. Bright colors, sudden sounds, sharp contrasts, emotionally loaded words, or unexpected changes. This reflex is meant to protect you, but it becomes a psychological trap when someone deliberately engineers what your brain perceives as important, guiding your attention toward what benefits them while burying the truth beneath the things you never thought to question. The disturbing part is how effortlessly this manipulation bypasses logic, sinking its hooks directly into the automatic systems that decide what you pay attention to. When salience is hijacked, your perception becomes skewed without you realizing the shift. A single highlighted detail can overshadow the full picture, making you blind to quieter, more critical information. A sudden emotional trigger can pull your thoughts off course, forcing your mind to prioritize the wrong target. Flashy distractions can conceal subtle changes, while dramatic cues can make irrelevant details feel meaningful. Your brain believes it is choosing what matters, yet the choice has already been made for you through deliberate manipulation of contrast, relevance, and emotional weight. This becomes especially potent in moments of pressure, anxiety, or excitement when the mind desperately seeks an anchor point. A manipulator only has to amplify one cue, a word, a gesture, a fear, a promise, to override your natural evaluation process. Without ever raising suspicion, they steer your awareness exactly where they want it, leaving you convinced the highlighted detail was your own priority rather than an implanted one designed to control what you notice and what you ignore. Forced attentional tunneling. Forced attentional tunneling is the deliberate manipulation of a mind pushed into an artificially narrowed state of focus, where everything outside a single point of attention collapses into darkness. It hijacks the brain's survival-driven instinct to lock on to what seems urgent or threatening, funneling all cognitive resources into one target while leaving the rest of reality unguarded and unseen. The disturbing power of this hack lies in how easily it overrides a person's broader awareness, transforming their perception into a tunnel where only the chosen detail exists and everything else fades into irrelevance. When someone is emotionally charged, stressed, pressured, frightened, infatuated, or overwhelmed, the brain's natural inclination to narrow its focus becomes a weapon. A manipulator can intensify this narrowing through urgency, emotional triggers, or strategic conflict, guiding the person into a mental corridor where judgment shrinks, options feel limited, and alternative perspectives disappear. In this state, even intelligent people fail to notice contradictions, context, or hidden motives because their mind has been corralled into a single direction, blind to the world outside the tunnel's walls. What makes forced attentional tunneling so unsettling is how convincing it feels from the inside. The person believes they are concentrating, being decisive, or responding logically, when in reality they are being steered. Their brain quietly suppresses everything except the stimulus dominating their attention, creating a false sense of clarity that masks how much they are missing. Moments of high emotion make this vulnerability especially potent. When the tunnel closes, awareness dims, and the mind follows the path laid out before it, unaware that someone else is shaping the spotlight that determines what is seen and what is dangerously ignored. Sensory overload. Sensory overload is the deliberate flooding of the brain's processing channels with more information than it can comfortably handle, forcing the mind into a vulnerable state where clarity dissolves, defenses weaken, and instinct replaces rational thought. The human brain is built to filter reality, not absorb all of it. And when stimuli exceed its limits, too much noise, too many lights, too many conflicting sensations, it begins to shut down the higher level reasoning that normally keeps you grounded. What makes sensory overload so unsettling is not the chaos itself, but what happens inside you when the mind can no longer keep up. Your awareness shatters into fragments, and the simplest decision can feel impossible. As senses collide and compete, the brain's priority shifts from understanding to survival. Logical thinking becomes sluggish, attention splinters, and emotional reactions intensify. In this state, people become increasingly suggestible because their mind is desperately searching for something, anything, that offers relief or direction. A single voice, a single gesture, or a single idea can feel disproportionately comforting amidst the turmoil, giving it far more influence than it deserves. This is why environments filled with flashing screens, overlapping noise, or chaotic motion so easily distort perception and judgment. The haunting part is that overload doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like losing your grip on the world while trying to pretend you're still in control. The more the senses are overwhelmed, the more the brain retreats inward, leaving pockets of awareness unguarded. In moments where everything is too loud, too bright, or too fast,
a person can become blind to what matters most, simply because the mind cannot hold itself together long enough to see through the storm. Repetition-Induced Familiarity Bias. Repetition-induced familiarity bias is the eerie psychological phenomenon where something becomes believable, trustworthy, or emotionally comfortable simply because it has been repeated enough times. The brain, designed to conserve energy, mistakes familiarity for truth, absorbing repeated information with far less resistance than new or conflicting ideas. What makes this bias disturbing is not just how effortlessly it forms, but how silently it rewires judgment. The more often a message appears, whether true, false, harmful, or benign, the more the mind begins to accept it as reality, allowing someone to reshape beliefs not through evidence, but through persistence. When a phrase, idea, or narrative is echoed again and again, the brain gradually stops analyzing it. The cognitive guardrails loosen, skepticism weakens, and the repeated message begins to feel natural. Familiarity is calming, and the mind gravitates toward it instinctively. Even when repetition is obvious, it still works. The brain's primitive architecture was built in a world where repeated information usually signaled importance, safety, or shared truth. In the modern world, this instinct becomes dangerously exploitable. Manipulators can take advantage of this by planting the same idea in different forms through subtle phrasing, casual remarks, or consistent emotional tones. Each repetition burrows deeper, bypassing critical thought and molding perception one echo at a time. The alarming part is how confident people feel in these manufactured beliefs, unaware that their conviction may be nothing more than accumulated exposure. This bias shows how fragile perception can be, how easily familiarity masquerades as truth, and how quickly repeated ideas can become internal realities long before the conscious mind realizes anything has changed. Pattern forcing. Pattern forcing is the deliberate exploitation of the brain's desperate need to find structure, meaning, and predictability, even in situations where none truly exists. Humans are wired to search for patterns as a survival instinct, constantly stitching together fragments of information to create a sense of order. But this instinct becomes a psychological vulnerability the moment someone arranges events, words, or visual cues in just the right way to make your mind complete the picture they want you to see. The disturbing part is that the pattern doesn't have to be real. Your brain will build it for them, constructing connections out of coincidence and filling gaps with assumptions that feel like truth. When pattern forcing takes hold, your perception subtly shifts. You begin to link unrelated details, interpreting random occurrences as meaningful because they appear to fit the narrative being suggested. A manipulator only needs to provide a few carefully selected pieces, and your mind will eagerly assemble the rest, convinced it has discovered the bigger story. Once a pattern is formed, even a false one, the brain clings to it with unsettling loyalty, filtering out anything that contradicts it while magnifying anything that supports it. This becomes especially powerful in moments of doubt, fear, or curiosity, when the mind seeks stability the most. A person can guide your interpretation of reality simply by nudging your brain towards certain connections, letting your imagination fill in the missing pieces. The terrifying truth is that once you believe you've figured out a pattern, it becomes incredibly difficult to question it. Allowing someone else to shape your perception using nothing more than strategically placed fragments that your own mind eagerly transforms into meaning. Cognitive saturation. Cognitive saturation is the overwhelming of the mind's limited processing capacity until thoughts blur, judgment weakens, and a person becomes vulnerable to suggestion without realizing they've crossed the threshold. The human brain can only hold so much information at once. When that limit is breached, the mind begins to shut down higher reasoning in favor of quick, automatic responses. What makes cognitive saturation disturbing is how silently it takes over. It doesn't feel like losing control. It feels like trying to keep up, like pushing through mental fog, unaware that clarity has already slipped away. In moments of overload, the brain prioritizes survival over accuracy. Logical thinking falters, emotional impulses strengthen, and the mind becomes desperate for simplicity. A manipulator who understands this can bombard someone with rapid information, emotional swings, conflicting messages, or relentless stimuli until the person grows mentally exhausted. As their cognitive bandwidth collapses, they grasp for anything stable, any voice that feels certain, any direction that cuts through the chaos. And in that desperate search for relief, they become highly susceptible to external influence. The unsettling truth is that cognitive saturation doesn't require extreme conditions. Modern life creates it constantly. Notifications, decisions, conversations, deadlines, emotional pressures, all piling up until the brain reaches its breaking point. In this state, people overlook details, accept statements without questioning, agree to things they would normally resist, and struggle to differentiate what's important from what's noise. The saturation feels natural, even inevitable, all while the mind drifts quietly into a mode where it becomes easier for someone else to steer thoughts, shape perceptions, or slip ideas into the gaps left behind by mental fatigue. Memory reconsolidation vulnerability. Memory reconsolidation vulnerability is the deeply unsettling phenomenon in which a memory, once recalled, becomes soft, unstable, and dangerously open to alteration before being stored again. Every time you remember something, the brain isn't simply replaying it, it is rebuilding it. And during that brief window of reconstruction, the tiniest shift in emotion, wording, or context can reshape the memory itself. What makes this so disturbing is that the mind doesn't warn you when a memory is changing. It lets you believe the altered version is the original, even when crucial details have quietly been rewritten. When someone triggers a memory, especially one tied to strong emotion, they open a doorway into the architecture of your past. While you're focused on the feelings the memory brings up, the brain becomes highly suggestible, eager to incorporate whatever new information appears alongside it. A gentle implication, a reinterpreted meaning, or a subtle reframing can slip into the memory as if it always belonged there. The person experiencing this shift won't notice the intrusion. They'll only feel more certain of a memory that has already begun to betray them. This vulnerability intensifies when someone is confused, distressed, or searching for clarity. In those moments, the mind tries even harder to tidy the memory into something coherent, and in doing so, becomes willing to accept outside suggestions as part of the internal narrative. Someone can twist your perception of events simply by being present at the right emotional moment, guiding what your brain chooses to keep or discard. The most chilling part is that once a memory is reconsolidated, the edited version becomes the truth you swear by, while the original fades into something you can no longer access, question, or even recognize. False memory seeding. False memory seeding is the deeply unsettling manipulation of the human mind's most sacred function, memory. People believe their memories define them, anchor them, protect them, but the truth is far more fragile. Memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction, rewritten every time it is recalled. This vulnerability becomes dangerous when someone deliberately introduces suggestions, details, or emotional cues that blend seamlessly into your recollection, causing you to remember events that never happened or distort those that did. What makes false memory seeding so disturbing is how real these implanted memories feel. Vivid, emotional, and deeply convincing, even when they are entirely fabricated. The human brain fills gaps in memory automatically to create coherent narratives. All it takes is a carefully placed suggestion at the right moment, during confusion, emotional vulnerability, or intense focus, for the mind to adopt it as its own. A single leading question, a confident statement, or a gently implied scenario can slip beneath conscious awareness and anchor itself into personal history. Over time, the brain reinforces it, polishing the falsehood with imagined details until it feels more authentic than the truth. Manipulators exploit this by weaving their version of events into your moments of uncertainty, knowing that the mind desperately wants a complete story. Once the seed is planted, the psyche does the rest, nurturing a memory that feels emotionally charged and unmistakably yours. The most unnerving part is that people defend these implanted memories with absolute conviction, never realizing the original moment was quietly rewritten in the shadows of their own mind. Source memory misattribution. Source memory misattribution is the unnerving phenomenon where the brain remembers information accurately but forgets where it came from, leaving you vulnerable to believing ideas, impressions, or emotions that were never yours to begin with. The mind, always trying to conserve effort, often separates content from origin, storing the memory but discarding the context. This creates a dangerous opening for manipulation because once the source is lost, the brain becomes eager to attach the memory to whatever feels familiar, trustworthy, or emotionally fitting, even if that association is completely false. What makes this so disturbing is how confidently the mind insists it remembers correctly, even as it rewires the origin of the thought without your consent. When source memory misattribution is triggered, the brain can take a suggestion someone whispered in passing and later make you believe you came up with it. A rumor heard once can later feel like something you witnessed yourself. A manipulator's opinion can resurface as your own belief because the emotional imprint remains while the true source fades into the background. This cognitive glitch becomes especially potent when paired with repetition, emotional charge, or moments of vulnerability, as the brain blends influences into memory fragments that feel authentic simply because they exist within your mind. People rarely suspect this process happening. You trust your memories, you trust your thoughts, yet source memory misattribution reveals that your internal world can be rewritten quietly, subtly, and with absolute conviction. A person who understands this weakness can plant ideas you later defend as your own, leaving you unaware of how deeply someone else has reached into your mental archive and rearranged the origins of your reality. Leading question distortion. Leading question distortion is the subtle reshaping of someone's thoughts through carefully crafted questions that smuggle assumptions, emotions, or false premises directly into their mind. Instead of presenting information outright, the manipulator hides it inside the structure of the question itself, forcing the brain to process the implied message before it can even evaluate its truth. The frightening part is how effortlessly the mind absorbs these embedded suggestions, often without noticing they were planted there in the first place. A question doesn't feel like persuasion, it feels like curiosity, even when it's quietly rewriting a person's perception. When a question includes a built-in assumption, "Why are you so unsure about this?" or "When did you start doubting yourself?" the brain instinctively works to answer it rather than challenge its foundation. The victim begins to engage with the implication as though it were a fact, and once the seed is accepted, it grows. Emotional questions hit even harder. A simple shift in tone, accusatory, sympathetic, disappointed, can warp memory, alter confidence, and reshape how past events are interpreted. The mind, already wired to cooperate in conversations, rarely pauses to analyze the question's hidden agenda. Under stress or uncertainty, people become even more susceptible. Their defenses drop, their need for clarity rises, and their willingness to accept implied meanings increases. The manipulator doesn't have to prove anything. They only have to ask the right question in the right moment. What makes this so unsettling is that the distortion feels self-generated. The person believes they reached the conclusion on their own, unaware that the question guided their thoughts down a predetermined path long before they realize their perspective had shifted. Narrative reframing. Narrative reframing is the chilling psychological maneuver in which someone alters the meaning of your experiences, not by changing the events themselves, but by changing the story wrapped around them. The human mind doesn't store memories as raw data. It stores them as narratives, complete with interpretations, emotional tones, and implied causes. This makes you vulnerable, because if someone can shift the frame around your story, they can shift how you feel about it, how you remember it, and even who you believe you are. Narrative reframing doesn't attack facts. It attacks meaning, and meaning is what the mind clings to most desperately. When a person reframes a narrative, they take something familiar and tilt it just enough to make you question your own perspective. A mistake becomes a flaw, a coincidence becomes a pattern, a neutral event becomes a judgment against you. They can twist victories into accidents, betrayals into misunderstandings, or doubts into signs of weakness. These shifts feel subtle, almost harmless at first, but each one nudges your emotional compass in a new direction until the internal story you rely on no longer feels like your own. You don't notice the manipulation happening because the reframed version often feels strangely logical, as if you've simply thought about it differently. This vulnerability deepens when someone reframes your story during moments of confusion, guilt, or emotional instability. In those states, the mind desperately seeks explanations that make the world feel organized again, and it becomes dangerously willing to accept someone else's narrative as the missing piece. The most disturbing aspect is how permanent these shifts can be, leaving you living inside a story crafted by another person while believing it was yours all along. Interference-based memory decay. Interference-based memory decay is the haunting psychological phenomenon where new information quietly erodes old memories, not by force, but by suffocating them beneath layers of competing details. The brain has limited space for similar pieces of information, and when too many overlap, the older ones begin to blur, weaken, or vanish. What makes this so unnerving is how naturally it happens and how easily it can be influenced. A person can lose clarity about events they once recalled vividly simply because their mind is bombarded with new narratives, new explanations, or new emotional frames that crowd the original memory into obscurity. The brain constantly rewrites and updates itself, and when multiple versions of an event exist, each with different emotions, interpretations, or timing, the mind chooses the one it encountered most recently or most intensely. The rest fades away, dissolving into fragments that feel distant and unreliable. Manipulators can exploit this fragile process by introducing subtle modifications, distractions, or alternate accounts that force the brain to juggle too much at once. As these new impressions accumulate, the original memory loses its footing, becoming diluted until it no longer feels trustworthy. The disturbing part is how confident people remain even as their memories deteriorate. They sense the fog but rarely suspect its cause. The mind fills in missing pieces with assumptions, guesses, or whatever new information is most accessible, leaving someone convinced they remember the truth when they are actually recalling a distorted reconstruction. Interference-based memory decay reveals a chilling vulnerability. Your past can be altered not by erasing it, but by quietly drowning it beneath waves of new impressions until it slips away unnoticed. Chronological confusion. Chronological confusion is the psychological disruption that occurs when the order of events becomes blurred, rearranged, or partially overwritten by the mind's tendency to prioritize emotion over accuracy. The brain does not store memories like a timeline. It stores fragments, impressions, sensations, and meanings, then reconstructs the sequence afterward. This reconstruction is fragile, vulnerable to suggestion, and frighteningly easy to distort. When someone manipulates emotional intensity, pacing, or context, your mind can lose track of what happened first, what happened last, and what happened at all, leaving you with a narrative that feels certain yet sits on a cracked foundation. This vulnerability becomes disturbing because the brain fills gaps automatically, often without your awareness. A highly emotional moment can overshadow the moment surrounding it, causing earlier or later events to merge into a single memory. A manipulator can subtly reframe the sequence of events, and your mind, wanting coherence more than truth, will reshape the timeline to match the new story. Over time, you may find yourself defending a rearranged memory simply because it feels familiar, even if the original chronology has been quietly dismantled. Chronological confusion is especially potent in situations involving stress, conflict, or rapid change, where the mind's ability to anchor time becomes compromised. A person can rush you, slow you down, overload you, or emotionally spike you just enough to scramble the order in which things were perceived. Once the timeline is disrupted, your sense of cause and effect becomes vulnerable. You may believe one event triggered another when they were unrelated, or assume something important never happened because it no longer fits the mental sequence your brain has reconstructed. In that disordered space, someone else can shape the story while you unknowingly accept their timeline as your own. Context switch disruption. Context switch disruption is the exploitation of the brain's weakest moment, the split second when it transitions between tasks, environments, or emotional states and becomes disoriented, vulnerable, and far more suggestible than usual. The mind depends heavily on context to understand reality. It uses surroundings, tone, purpose, and emotional cues to stabilize perception. When that context abruptly shifts, the brain scrambles to recalibrate, leaving a brief window where clarity wavers and cognitive defenses loosen. This disorientation is subtle, often invisible, yet powerful enough to distort memory, weaken logic, and reroute decision-making without the person realizing anything has changed. During a context switch, the mind temporarily drops the previous mental frame before it constructs the new one. In that fragile gap, suggestion sinks deeper because the brain is actively searching for cues to rebuild stability. Manipulators exploit this by interrupting conversations at key moments, switching topics before answers solidify, altering emotional tone mid-discussion, or shifting settings abruptly to throw a person off balance. Each switch fragments the victim's mental continuity, making it harder to track inconsistencies, question motives, or maintain a firm sense of what's true. The unsettling danger emerges when context switch disruption is repeated. With each shift, the victim becomes more mentally scattered, more dependent on the manipulator to define the new context, and less confident in their own interpretations. Decisions made under these conditions often feel strangely disconnected from a person's actual beliefs, as though they were nudged into agreement without ever forming a stable thought. The mind seeks coherence, but in the haze between contexts, it becomes frighteningly easy for someone else to supply it. Detail insertion. Detail insertion is the unnerving psychological tactic where someone subtly adds new elements into your memories, stories, or recollections until you accept these invented details as if they were always there. The human mind craves completion, preferring a flawed narrative over an incomplete one, and this instinct creates a vulnerability manipulators can quietly exploit. When a memory is fragile, especially during moments of recall, the brain becomes eager to stitch in anything that feels familiar, emotionally fitting, or contextually convenient. What makes detail insertion so disturbing is how easily a single added element can reshape the entire memory, altering not just what you remember, but how you feel about it. This technique often begins with a harmless suggestion, something small and plausible, a facial expression you must have seen, a conversation you probably had, a reaction you would have shown. Your brain, desperate for cohesion, fills in the blank without realizing the blank wasn't yours to fill. Once the new detail settles into place, it changes the emotional weight of the memory, turning neutrality into threat, trust into suspicion, or confusion into certainty. A subtle shift grows into a foundation, and the more you revisit the memory, the stronger the inserted detail becomes. Detail insertion becomes especially potent when used during emotional recall. A person overwhelmed by guilt, fear, or uncertainty is more likely to adopt added elements because they feel like they explained something previously unclear. The haunting truth is that well-placed details can transform your past piece by piece until you're left clinging to memories that never truly belong to you. The brain doesn't just accept false details, it protects them, defends them, and believes in them with absolute confidence. Narrative replacement. Narrative replacement is the unsettling psychological intrusion where the story you once believed about an experience is gradually overwritten by a new, carefully crafted version. Humans rely on narratives to make sense of their lives. Every memory, emotion, and decision is anchored in the stories the mind tells itself. But these stories are far more malleable than people want to believe. When someone introduces a different explanation, a new interpretation, or a reframed emotional angle, the brain begins to reshape its understanding of the original event. Over time, the new narrative does not merely coexist with the old one, it quietly pushes it out, rewriting your internal history without your permission. This manipulation preys on the fact that the brain values coherence over truth. When presented with a clearer, more emotionally charged, or more confidently delivered narrative, the mind gravitates toward it, even if it contradicts earlier memories. If the original experience was confusing, incomplete, or emotionally ambivalent, the vulnerability becomes even greater. The new story fills in the cracks, smoothing the rough edges, offering an explanation that feels more satisfying than the reality you once lived. Manipulators exploit this by repeating their version of events with unwavering confidence, gradually guiding your mind to reinterpret your own memories through their lens. They introduce subtle shifts first, changes in motives, meanings, or emotions, before escalating into full rewrites. Eventually, the altered narrative becomes the dominant truth your mind clings to, while the authentic memory fades into something uncertain and unstable. The most chilling aspect is how natural the process feels, how silently the old story is replaced, and how deeply a borrowed narrative can become mistaken for your own. Embedded commands. Embedded commands are the covert insertion of directive phrases hidden within ordinary speech, designed to slip past conscious scrutiny and influence the subconscious while the listener believes they're simply having a normal conversation. The unsettling power of this technique lies in its invisibility. The command is buried inside a larger sentence, wrapped in casual language, emotional cues, or storytelling, so that the conscious mind dismisses it while the deeper layers of the brain absorb it without resistance. Humans naturally focus on meaning rather than structure, making it disturbingly easy for someone to smuggle suggestions into the spaces where attention drifts. The mind processes language on multiple levels at once. While you consciously follow the surface message, your subconscious is constantly scanning for emotional significance, tone shifts, and patterns that hint at what's important. A manipulator exploits this by placing impactful phrases in positions where your attention is weakest, mid-sentence, after a pause, inside a dramatic moment, or emphasized subtly through rhythm, repetition, or vocal inflection. Even if you don't consciously register the phrase, your subconscious may treat it as meaningful, planting it like a seed that feels self-generated rather than externally delivered. This phenomenon becomes particularly disturbing when someone weaves these hidden directives into emotionally charged stories or vulnerable conversations. In those moments, your mental defenses soften, and the subconscious becomes more receptive to anything that feels connected to the emotional flow. A person can guide your feelings, reactions, or interpretations not by stating what they want, but by embedding their intention beneath the words you think you're analyzing. The most haunting part is how natural it can all feel, because the suggestion doesn't feel like it came from them, it feels like it came from you. Ambiguity Exploitation. Ambiguity exploitation is the calculated use of unclear words, vague explanations, and open-ended phrasing to bend someone's perception while giving them nothing solid to challenge. The human brain hates uncertainty. It will instinctively try to fill in gaps, make assumptions, and impose meaning where none was provided. A manipulator uses this instinct as a psychological trap. By presenting statements that could mean several things at once, they force the victim to create their own interpretation, an interpretation that can later be used against them. What makes ambiguity exploitation so deeply unsettling is that the victim often believes they understood perfectly, unaware that the clarity they trusted came entirely from their own mind, not from the manipulator's words. Ambiguity becomes most effective in emotional or high-pressure conversations when someone desperately wants reassurance, approval, or direction. Their mind becomes eager to resolve uncertainty as fast as possible. They latch onto the meaning they want to hear, ignoring the fact that the manipulator never actually said it. Phrases like, "You know what I mean," "It's not a big deal," or "Things will work out," feel comforting, but they carry no concrete commitment. The victim is left with the illusion of understanding, while the manipulator maintains complete flexibility over what they meant. The true psychological danger lies in how ambiguity blurs accountability. If confronted, the manipulator can shift meanings effortlessly, claiming misunderstanding, misinterpretation, or oversensitivity. The victim begins doubting their own ability to comprehend reality, a quiet erosion of confidence that deepens with each ambiguous exchange. The brain craves answers, but ambiguity turns that craving into a vulnerability, one that lets someone else guide your thoughts while making you believe the conclusions were entirely your own. Semantic overload. Semantic overload is the psychological tactic of drowning the mind in excessive language. Too many words, too many meanings, too many interpretations, until the brain can no longer separate clarity from confusion. When someone is hit with a rapid stream of complex terms, layered concepts, or tangled explanations, the conscious mind begins to slip. It scrambles to keep up, forcing you into a vulnerable state where you grasp for the simplest thread of meaning, desperate for something that feels stable. This vulnerability becomes especially dangerous because the brain, under linguistic pressure, will often accept whatever interpretation is offered next, simply to escape the overwhelm. Semantic overload works by weaponizing the brain's need to make sense of information. Faced with dense or contradictory language, the mind experiences a subtle panic, a rising tension beneath awareness. You feel yourself trying to latch onto key phrases, trying to decode something that feels important but keeps slipping away. Manipulators use this moment to slip in their preferred meaning, guiding your thoughts without ever appearing forceful. The sheer weight of the language becomes a smokescreen, hiding the shift in perspective happening beneath the surface. This tactic becomes even more potent when used during arguments, negotiations, or emotional conversations. The more mentally exhausted a person becomes, the more likely they are to accept simplified explanations or adopt the manipulator's framing just to alleviate the cognitive strain. The disturbing truth is that semantic overload doesn't silence your voice. It buries it under a mountain of words until you forget what you were trying to say, surrendering not because you agree, but because your mind can't fight through the fog long enough to hold its ground. Emotionally charged phrasing is the psychological intrusion that bypasses rational thought by injecting words with enough emotional force to override logic, caution, and objectivity. Humans respond to emotion faster than reason. The brain is wired to treat emotionally loaded language as a threat, a promise, or a call to action long before it analyzes the content. This vulnerability becomes deeply unsettling when someone intentionally crafts phrases designed to evoke fear, urgency, guilt, hope, or longing, pulling you into an emotional current that sweeps away critical thinking. The power of these words doesn't come from their meaning, it comes from the reaction they provoke inside you. When emotional phrasing hits the mind, the amygdala activates first. Your heartbeat quickens, your breathing shifts, and the thinking parts of your brain dim as instinct takes the wheel. A simple sentence can make you feel unsafe, indebted, seen, or exposed. The emotional weight convinces the mind that the message is important, even when it isn't. Once hooked, you begin to interpret everything through the lens that language created, allowing the speaker to steer perception, memory, and even future behavior with nothing more than carefully chosen words. Manipulators exploit this by weaving emotionally charged phrases into conversations at moments of vulnerability. When you're uncertain, overwhelmed, or looking for reassurance, they attach emotion to their message so strongly that you feel the words before you understand them, leaving you responding to impulses you didn't consciously choose. The disturbing part is how quickly emotional phrasing embeds itself, how easily it shapes your reactions, and how silently it can become the invisible hand guiding your decisions without ever revealing its true influence. False dichotomy. Forcing false dichotomy. Forcing is the psychological trap created when someone presents two choices as if they are the only possibilities, pushing your mind into a narrow corridor where freedom appears intact but the outcome has already been engineered. The human brain craves clarity, especially under pressure, and when confronted with what seems like a simple either-or scenario, it instinctively gravitates toward choosing rather than questioning. This vulnerability becomes chilling when someone uses it to collapse your options, making you feel cornered without realizing the cage was built through language rather than reality. In moments of stress, urgency, or emotional intensity, the mind becomes desperate for resolution. A manipulator exploits this by framing the situation so that agreeing with them appears to be the reasonable option, and disagreeing feels irrational, hostile, or self-destructive. You begin evaluating only the presented pathways, unaware that numerous alternatives have been deliberately hidden from your awareness. As you focus on choosing between the two framed outcomes, your brain stops looking for escape routes, and your sense of autonomy shrinks into the illusion of choice. What makes false dichotomy forcing so haunting is how natural it feels. The options sound definitive, the logic appears sound, and the emotional pressure encourages quick decisions. Over time, repeated exposure to these narrow frames can condition someone to accept limited choices in every situation, shaping their worldview to align with the manipulator's structure. You start believing that decisions are always binary, that disagreement always carries a penalty, and that subtle coercion is simply how reality works. And by the time you begin to question the missing third option, the one never offered, it often feels too distant, too unclear, or too forbidden to consider, leaving your perception shaped not by truth, but by the limits someone else quietly imposed. Conversational reframing. Conversational reframing is the subtle redirection of how someone interprets a situation by shifting the meaning, angle, or emotional tone of the conversation without changing the underlying facts. It's not about altering reality. It's about altering the lens through which reality is viewed. The unsettling power of reframing lies in how invisible it feels. A single shift in wording can make guilt feel like responsibility, manipulation feel like concern, pressure feel like encouragement, or doubt feel like insight. The person on the receiving end rarely notices the transition. Their emotions follow the new frame before their logic has a chance to protest. A manipulator uses reframing to reshape someone's perception while appearing helpful, rational, or even compassionate. By subtly redefining the meaning of an event, they can guide the conversation toward conclusions that benefit them. Tension becomes miscommunication, criticism becomes constructive feedback, and personal boundaries become overreactions. These small linguistic pivots influence how the brain categorizes experiences, quietly reshaping emotional responses and altering what a person believes about themselves and the situation unfolding around them. Reframing becomes even more potent when the target is confused, stressed, or searching for clarity. In those moments, people are desperate for a narrative that makes sense. When someone offers a neatly packaged reinterpretation, the mind grasps onto it as relief. The victim begins adopting the new frame as if it were their own perspective, unaware it was implanted through strategic wording rather than genuine realization. What makes conversational reframing so psychologically disturbing is how quickly it can erode certainty. A person walks into a discussion sure of what they felt, what they saw, what they believed, only to walk away holding a completely different story, convinced that it was their idea all along. Indirect suggestion. Indirect suggestion is the eerie psychological technique where someone plants an idea in your mind without ever stating it outright, allowing the thought to bloom as if it were your own. The brain is far more receptive to messages that feel self-generated, and manipulators exploit this by sprinkling hints, implications, and carefully chosen phrases designed to steer your thoughts without triggering your defenses. What makes indirect suggestion so unsettling is the way it bypasses resistance. It doesn't confront your beliefs, it seduces them, slipping beneath awareness until you begin to crave, fear, or question exactly what the manipulator wanted all along. Instead of direct commands, indirect suggestion uses subtle cues, tones, pauses, metaphors, unfinished sentences that invite your mind to fill in the meaning. And when you complete the thought yourself, it feels authentic, internal, and undeniably true. Your brain embraces the idea because it believes it originated inside you, when in reality, it was gently shaped from the outside. This form of influence thrives in moments of vulnerability, especially when someone is uncertain, emotional, or searching for understanding. In those moments, the smallest hint can feel like revelation. Indirect suggestion becomes even more powerful when layered within conversation. A manipulator may mention an unrelated story, evoke a specific emotion, or ask leading questions that nudge your subconscious toward a conclusion they never had to voice. You sense the shift happening inside you, but you can't pinpoint its origin, and that's what makes it so psychologically haunting. You walk away convinced you arrived at the thought independently, unaware of the invisible fingerprints left on the edges of your mind. Anchoring phrases are the psychological hooks that lock your mind onto a specific idea, emotion, or expectation before you even realize it's happening. They work by planting a reference point so deeply into your perception that everything you think afterward bends around it. The disturbing part is how effortlessly this can be done with just a few carefully chosen words. Once an anchor is placed, a number, a label, a comparison, a prediction, your brain begins to treat it as the starting point for reality, even if it is arbitrary, misleading, or intentionally manipulative. The mind uses anchors because it craves certainty. When faced with ambiguity, confusion,
or emotional turbulence, it latches onto the first stable concept presented, building every judgment on top of it. A simple phrase like, "Most people agree," "This is expensive," or "You're usually good at this," becomes a mental gravity well that pulls perceptions, decisions, and emotions into alignment. Even when you believe you're thinking independently, the anchor quietly shapes your interpretation of everything that follows. Manipulators exploit anchoring phrases with calculated precision. They set the reference point early, before you have time to think, question, or resist, knowing the mind will cling to it instinctively. They may exaggerate a problem so the solution feels reasonable, inflate a number so anything lower seems fair, or frame your behavior to steer your emotional response. Once the anchor settles, the mind begins adjusting around it, never noticing that its entire decision-making process has been rerouted. The unsettling truth is how invisible anchoring feels. You don't sense the moment your perspective is captured. You only feel the strange pull of an idea that seems to make sense, unaware that your reality was quietly tethered to someone else's words. Authority language triggering. Authority language triggering is the calculated use of words, tones, and linguistic structures that activate the brain's instinctive deference to perceived power. Humans have been conditioned since childhood to respond to certain verbal cues, orders from teachers, warnings from parents, instructions from leaders, and those patterns embed themselves deep within the subconscious. When someone deliberately uses this style of language, the mind reacts automatically, often complying before logic has time to intervene. The disturbing part is how subtle the trigger can be. A shift in tone, a firm directive, a confident phrase, or even the cadence of someone's speech can flip the internal switch that makes obedience feel like the safest path. Authority language doesn't need to sound aggressive. It only needs to sound certain. The brain equates certainty with competence, and competence with safety, making you more likely to accept statements delivered with authoritative phrasing. A manipulator can layer commands inside statements that sound helpful, necessary, or inevitable, guiding your actions without ever giving you space to question them. Phrases that evoke duty, responsibility, urgency, or inevitability slip beneath conscious awareness, creating a subtle pressure to comply simply because the words feel like they should be followed. This vulnerability intensifies when you're stressed, unsure, or emotionally overwhelmed. In those moments, the mind craves direction, and authority language becomes a beacon that feels comforting even as it restricts your autonomy. A person speaking with absolute conviction can override your hesitation, steer your decisions, and frame their perspective as the only rational path. The most unsettling aspect is that you may find yourself obeying not because you agree, but because the language taps into something ancient and automatic, an internal echo of every command you were ever conditioned to accept. Conversational misdirection. Conversational misdirection is the deliberate redirection of a person's focus during a discussion, guiding them away from crucial details while making them believe the conversation is flowing naturally. It operates like a magician's sleight of hand, but instead of diverting the eyes, it diverts the mind. The manipulator doesn't silence the truth. They simply drown it in irrelevance, shift the emotional tone, or introduce a new point at the perfect moment. The victim leaves the conversation feeling like they understood everything, unaware that their attention was subtly steered away from the very thing that mattered most. The danger of conversational misdirection lies in its seamlessness. People assume they control what they pay attention to, yet the human mind unconsciously follows emotional cues, changes in tone, unexpected questions, and sudden shifts in topic. A manipulator takes advantage of this by strategically placing emotional triggers or distractions right when the conversation approaches something revealing or uncomfortable. They may introduce humor to diffuse seriousness,
Switch to a personal story when accountability approaches, or ask an unrelated question that pulls the mind in a safer direction. This technique becomes especially potent when the target is emotionally invested, tired, or seeking resolution. In these moments, the brain prioritizes comfort over confrontation, happily following the new conversational path without questioning why the old one was abandoned. Over time, the victim begins to feel confused about what was actually discussed, unable to pinpoint how the conversation drifted so far from where it began. What makes conversational misdirection so unnerving is not the distraction itself, but the illusion of understanding it creates, leaving the victim certain they were paying attention while their awareness was quietly led somewhere else. Reciprocity pressure. Reciprocity pressure is the deeply unsettling psychological force that compels you to return favors, kindness, or generosity, even when you never asked for them, and even when the gift was designed to trap you. Humans are hardwired to maintain balance in their social exchanges. If someone gives you something, the brain floods with discomfort until you feel you've given something back. Manipulators exploit this instinct with chilling precision, offering help, attention, or generosity, not out of goodwill, but to create a debt you feel obligated to repay. The most disturbing part is how automatic this response is. You don't choose to feel indebted. The feeling rises in you like a reflex you cannot switch off. A simple gesture can become a psychological leash, a compliment, a small favor, an unexpected gift. Each one can plant the seed of obligation. Your mind begins to twist the situation, convincing you that you owe them kindness, time, trust, or compliance, even when the exchange is entirely unbalanced or unwanted. The pressure intensifies because refusing to reciprocate feels socially unnatural, almost like a violation of something ancient within you. This discomfort doesn't just influence decisions, it can reshape your behavior, making you act against your own interests simply to relieve the internal tension. Reciprocity pressure becomes even more powerful when used on someone overwhelmed, grateful, or desperate for connection. In those moments, the mind clings to the illusion of fairness so tightly that it willingly hands over loyalty or agreement just to restore psychological equilibrium. The haunting truth is that reciprocity doesn't need to be logical to control you. It only needs to feel like the right thing, allowing someone else to pull your strings with nothing more than a well-timed act of kindness. Social proof exploitation. Social proof exploitation is the psychological snare that weaponizes one of the brain's oldest survival instincts, the urge to follow the crowd. Humans are wired to assume that if many people believe something, approve something, or behave a certain way, it must be correct or safe. But this instinct becomes dangerous when someone deliberately manufactures the illusion of consensus to override your independent judgment. The chilling part is how quickly the mind surrenders its skepticism the moment it feels outnumbered, isolated, or uncertain, allowing social pressure to shape beliefs that never belonged to you. When you see others nodding, agreeing, endorsing, or participating, the brain interprets it as evidence, even when the others are carefully curated, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated. A single comment framed as what everyone thinks, a stage show of agreement, or a repeated reference to a supposed majority can push your mind into conformity without resistance. Under stress, fear of embarrassment, or desire for belonging, this vulnerability intensifies, and the need to fit in becomes stronger than the need to be right. Manipulators exploit social proof by surrounding you with signals that suggest widespread approval or unified belief. They might reference anonymous groups, invent shared opinions, or highlight selective examples to convince you that you're the odd one out if you disagree. Once the illusion takes hold, your brain aligns itself with the perceived group, suppressing doubts and amplifying the desire to conform. The terrifying aspect is how natural this shift feels, how quickly the mind swaps personal truth for collective influence, and how easily the appearance of consensus can lure someone into choices they would never make on their own. Scarcity pressure. Scarcity pressure is the psychological chokehold created when someone convinces your mind that an opportunity, resource, or moment is about to disappear, triggering a primal urgency that overrides rational thought. Humans are hardwired to fear loss more intensely than they value gain, and when something feels limited, time, attention, approval, opportunities, the brain floods with anxiety, pushing you toward impulsive decisions that feel necessary simply because the alternative feels like being left behind. This vulnerability becomes deeply unsettling when you realize how easily scarcity can be manufactured, turning a calm mind into a panicked one with just a few carefully delivered words. When scarcity pressure takes hold, your perception shifts dramatically. The present begins to feel like a vanishing window, and hesitation transforms into danger. Manipulators know this well. They tighten the emotional constraints by emphasizing deadlines, exclusivity, or consequences, making you feel like saying yes is the only way to avoid regret. As your stress rises, the mind stops evaluating options and starts scanning for escape. The scarcity becomes the trapdoor beneath your feet, pushing you into choices that benefit someone else while you believe you're acting out of necessity. This psychological mechanism becomes even more powerful when mixed with desire, insecurity, or uncertainty. A manipulator doesn't need to offer real scarcity, only the illusion of it. A statement like "others are already ahead of you" or "this chance won't come again" can hijack your reasoning instantly. Suddenly, you're not choosing because you want something. You're choosing because you're terrified of losing something you never truly had. Scarcity pressure doesn't force action with force. It forces action with fear, making you chase shadows while someone else quietly pulls the strings. Foot in the door escalation. Foot in the door escalation is the psychological trap created when someone gains compliance through a small, harmless request, only to gradually push that compliance into territory the victim would have refused outright. It works because the human mind is wired to maintain consistency. Once a person agrees to something minor, they subconsciously feel pressure to stay aligned with that behavior. The manipulator exploits this by slowly increasing the intensity, significance, or emotional weight of each request until the victim is doing things that no longer resemble the innocent first step. The chilling part is how natural the progression feels, how subtle the shifts are, and how rarely people realize they've crossed boundaries until long after the escalation is complete. The initial request is always designed to seem harmless, something easy, something that feels polite to agree to. Once granted, the manipulator praises the compliance, making the victim feel good about being cooperative, helpful, or understanding. Then comes the next request, just slightly larger, framed as a natural continuation of the first. Each step builds on the last, creating a psychological staircase the victim climbs voluntarily, unaware that the top is far darker than the bottom ever hinted. Emotional leverage amplifies the effect. People don't want to appear inconsistent or unreasonable, especially if they've already agreed to something related. The manipulator counts on this internal pressure, pushing the escalation at the exact speed that keeps the victim compliant but not alarmed. By the time the final request arrives, something they would have instantly rejected if presented at the beginning, the victim feels compelled to follow through, trapped by the path they unknowingly allowed themselves to walk. The unsettling truth is that the danger doesn't lie in the first step, but in how deceptively easy it is to take the next one. Door-in-the-face reversal. The door-in-the-face reversal is the psychologically jarring tactic where someone begins with an absurdly large request they know you'll refuse, only to follow it with the real request they intended all along. What makes this technique so disturbing is the emotional whiplash it produces, the instant relief you feel after rejecting the outrageous demand makes the smaller request seem harmless, reasonable, even generous by comparison. Your brain interprets the shift as a concession, and suddenly you feel pressured to reciprocate that compromise, even though you're walking straight into the exact decision they wanted from the start. When the first request hits, it's designed to shock your internal boundaries. You feel uncomfortable, defensive, maybe even offended, but when the second, much smaller request follows, immediately after, the contrast destabilizes your judgment. Relief mixes with guilt, and your mind clings to the idea that saying yes will restore balance. It's not logic guiding you, it's the emotional recoil from the initial pressure. You don't accept the smaller request because it's right. You accept it because refusing twice feels unbearably harsh. This reversal becomes even more potent when delivered with sincerity, disappointment, or subtle emotional cues. A manipulator may sigh, soften their voice, or appear understanding, creating the illusion that they've compromised for your sake. What you don't realize is that every beat of the exchange is orchestrated to make you feel responsible for easing the tension they manufactured. The most unsettling aspect is how effective this tactic is even when you're aware of it. Your boundaries bend, not because they were weak, but because the mind instinctively seeks emotional equilibrium, leaving you vulnerable to the suggestion that saying yes is simply the fair thing to do. Boundary erosion. Boundary erosion is the quiet psychological intrusion where someone gradually dissolves the limits that protect your autonomy, comfort, and identity. It doesn't happen in one obvious moment. It happens in tiny increments, so subtle that you rarely notice the shift until the lines you once held firm begin to blur. This manipulation works by slowly normalizing small violations, each one mild enough to dismiss, yet each one weakening your internal resistance. The disturbing part is that the brain adapts to repeated intrusions, adjusting its expectations until what once felt unacceptable begins to feel strangely ordinary. Boundary erosion often begins with harmless requests, gentle oversteps, or seemingly innocent emotional closeness. Your mind rationalizes the early breaches, telling itself that it's no big deal, that you're being dramatic, that you're simply being flexible. But each concession sets a precedent. The brain values consistency, and once it allows one violation, it becomes easier to allow the next. Over time, the manipulator pushes a little further, then further still, shaping your behavior by stretching your boundaries inch by inch. Emotion plays a powerful role in this process. Trust, affection, guilt, or fear can all weaken your ability to recognize what's happening. When someone frames their oversteps as caring, necessary, or your responsibility, your mind begins to question its instincts. You start to doubt your right to say no, your sense of what's appropriate, even your understanding of your own limits. The most unsettling aspect is how boundary erosion can feel like connection, closeness, or loyalty in the moment, while beneath the surface, it quietly rewires your expectations, leaving you vulnerable to deeper intrusions long before you realize anything has changed. Conformity pressure. Conformity pressure is the psychological weight that compels individuals to align their thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors with those of a surrounding group, even when every instinct inside them whispers that something is wrong. Humans are social creatures built for belonging, and the brain interprets isolation as danger. This makes conformity one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, not through logic, but through an ancient fear of standing alone. What makes this so disturbing is how quietly it operates. The group doesn't need to threaten you or even speak directly to you. Their mere agreement with each other creates a gravitational pull that drags your judgment toward theirs. Under conformity pressure, the mind begins to silence its own doubts. You may feel the truth burning under your skin, yet find yourself nodding along to avoid conflict, embarrassment, or rejection. A manipulator only needs to create the appearance of group consensus, real or fabricated, and your brain instinctively shifts to align with it. Even subtle cues like shared opinions, synchronized reactions, or collective silence can push you toward compliance. The deeper fear isn't that you're wrong, it's that being different will make you an outsider. This vulnerability intensifies in unfamiliar situations when uncertainty opens the door for group influence to fill the void. The terrifying part is how fast conformity can override personal values. A person surrounded by unified voices begins to question their own perception, wondering if the group sees something they don't. Before long, disagreement feels dangerous, individuality feels risky, and adopting the group's view feels like survival. In that moment, your autonomy quietly dissolves, replaced by the comfort of blending into the crowd, even if it costs you the truth you once trusted. Perceived consensus manipulation. Perceived consensus manipulation is the engineered illusion that everyone believes something, creating a powerful psychological pressure to conform even when the supposed majority doesn't exist at all. Humans are social creatures, wired to avoid isolation, conflict, and the risk of being wrong alone. When they believe an opinion, behavior, or decision is widely accepted, they instinctively relax their skepticism and align themselves with the group. The manipulator weaponizes this instinct by fabricating agreement through repeated claims, selective examples, staged approval, or exaggerated reactions until the victim feels surrounded by a consensus that isn't real. The human brain treats consensus as safety. If enough people seem to agree on something, the mind assumes it must be valid. This makes the illusion devastatingly effective. A manipulator doesn't have to prove their position. They only need to convince the victim that others already agree. They may reference unnamed sources, claim widespread support, or strategically showcase only the individuals who align with their agenda. As the victim senses growing agreement, their internal resistance fades, replaced by an urgent need to fit the supposed norm. Under stress or uncertainty, this effect intensifies. People look outward for direction, desperate to avoid standing alone. The manipulator counts on this vulnerability, creating a fabricated environment where dissent feels dangerous or foolish. The victim begins doubting their own judgment, questioning whether their hesitation is irrational if everyone else seems certain. What makes perceived consensus manipulation so disturbing is how quickly it transforms isolation into obedience. A person who once trusted their instincts can be pushed into silence or agreement simply by believing they are the last one holding out, when in reality, the crowd they fear standing against may never have existed at all. Fear of missing out activation. Fear of missing out activation is the psychological trigger that hijacks your survival instincts by convincing you that something valuable, rare, or life-changing is slipping through your fingers, and that if you don't act immediately, you will be left behind. The human brain is wired to equate scarcity with danger. Missing out once meant missing food, allies, or safety. Manipulators weaponize this ancient instinct by creating illusions of exclusivity, urgency, or comparison that make your heartbeat quicken and your judgment collapse beneath the terror of being the one who didn't get in, didn't show up, didn't choose fast enough. FOMO doesn't whisper. It claws at your mind, making you imagine everyone else advancing while you remain frozen. That vision alone can override reason. A simple phrase like limited time, everyone's already doing it, or you don't want to be the only one who misses this can light a fire of panic inside you. Suddenly, the decision stops being about what you want and becomes about what you fear losing. The emotional weight of exclusion becomes heavier than the logic of the choice itself. Manipulators spark this fear in subtle ways, by highlighting imaginary competition, by displaying selective success stories, or by implying that others have already taken the leap you're hesitating to make. In that moment of pressure, your brain stops evaluating the situation and starts scrambling to avoid regret. You feel pulled forward by urgency, convinced that action, any action, is better than being the person left on the outside looking in. The haunting part is that FOMO doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like instinct, like truth, like a warning you must obey immediately. And that's exactly why it works. Manufactured urgency. Manufactured urgency is the psychological pressure bomb that forces your mind into panic mode before it has the chance to think. It is the deliberate creation of artificial deadlines, fake emergencies, or sudden, high-stakes decisions designed to shut down your rational brain and push you into acting on impulse. Humans are wired to react quickly when something feels urgent, because throughout evolution, hesitation meant danger. But this instinct becomes a vulnerability the moment someone fabricates urgency to hijack your judgment. The terrifying part is how instantly your nervous system responds, even when the threat isn't real. When urgency is manufactured, your brain shifts into survival mode. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for critical thinking, analysis, and long-term planning, dims under the weight of adrenaline. The amygdala takes over, demanding action, not reflection. A fake deadline makes you feel like time is slipping away. A pressured choice makes you believe you must decide now. A sudden emotional spike tricks your mind into thinking the situation is too important to question. In that state, people accept worse deals, ignore red flags, and surrender control simply to escape the tension bearing down on them. Manipulators use manufactured urgency because it breaks resistance with disturbing speed. They impose countdowns, invoke threats of loss, or insist that hesitation equals failure. They know you'll feel rushed, cornered, and desperate to resolve the pressure. They know you'll act first and think later, and they know you'll question yourself only after the moment has passed. The unsettling truth is that urgency doesn't need to be real to feel real. Once that pressure grips your mind, even a fabricated crisis can push you into decisions you never would have made with a calm heartbeat and a clear head. Emotional hijacking. Emotional hijacking is the moment when your feelings surge so intensely and so suddenly that they seize control of your thoughts, reactions, and judgment before you even realize what's happening. It is the psychological ambush where your rational mind is shoved aside, replaced by a flood of instinctive emotion that dictates your behavior with terrifying force. The brain's emotional centers, especially the amygdala, can fire faster than conscious reasoning, creating a split-second takeover that leaves you acting on impulse while believing you're still choosing deliberately. The disturbing part is how easily this can be triggered, especially by someone who understands which emotions can dismantle your defenses quickest. When emotional hijacking occurs, your perception warps. A single comment, memory, expression, or tone can ignite anger, fear, shame, excitement, or longing so deeply that the world around you begins to bend around that one feeling. Logical arguments feel irrelevant. Counter-evidence feels invisible. The emotional surge becomes the lens through which you interpret everything, and a manipulator can exploit this by pushing your emotional buttons at the precise moment your guard drops. They can overwhelm you with praise to lower your skepticism, provoke fear to push you into compliance, or trigger guilt to make you vulnerable to influence. What makes emotional hijacking so unsettling is the illusion of agency it preserves. You feel like you're reacting naturally, not realizing the emotion was crafted, nudged, or strategically amplified. Once the surge takes hold, the manipulator no longer needs to push. You guide yourself in the direction they intended.
driven by an emotion that feels like truth. In that instant, your rationality becomes a spectator, watching helplessly as your emotional mind grips the wheel and steers you somewhere you never consciously chose to go. Fear susceptibility. Fear susceptibility is the chilling vulnerability that emerges when the human mind becomes consumed by threat, real or imagined, causing logic to shrink, judgment to warp, and survival instincts to seize control. Fear is supposed to protect us, but when exploited, it becomes a doorway into the deepest layers of the psyche, where decisions are made impulsively, memories distort, and people obey not because they agree, but because their nervous system is desperately trying to escape discomfort. The manipulator doesn't need evidence, reason, or truth. They only need to trigger the right kind of fear at the right moment, and the mind will do the rest of the work for them. Fear rewires attention instantly. It narrows the world into a single threat, suppressing the ability to question, analyze, or doubt. A raised voice, a sudden shift in tone, a subtle warning, or even an implied consequence can activate this primal circuitry. Once fear takes hold, the victim stops thinking in long-term consequences and begins reacting only in the moment, seeking the quickest relief. A manipulator exploits this by presenting themselves as the source of safety or the only path to avoid danger. The victim clings to guidance, blind to how easily they are being steered. Fear also amplifies suggestion. The brain in a defensive state becomes hypersensitive to any signal that promises protection or certainty. Even lies sound convincing when wrapped in urgency. The victim may comply, confess, agree, or retreat simply to soothe the internal panic rising within them. The haunting truth is that once fear takes over, the mind prioritizes escape over accuracy, making a person frighteningly easy to influence before they even realize they are afraid. Emotional isolation weakening. Emotional isolation weakening is the haunting psychological effect that occurs when someone is cut off, slowly or suddenly, from the emotional connections, support systems, and mirrors of reality that normally keep the mind grounded. Humans are not built to exist without emotional exchange. The brain depends on social bonds for regulation, perspective, and stability. When those bonds are removed, even subtly, the internal world begins to tilt. Confidence erodes, self-doubt expands, thoughts grow louder, darker, and harder to challenge because there is no one left to reflect them back with clarity or warmth. Isolation doesn't just create loneliness, it weakens the very structures that hold a person's identity together. What makes this phenomenon so disturbing is how quietly it unfolds. At first, it feels like space, silence, or independence. Then, slowly, the mind begins to crave connection with a desperation that feels almost physical. Without emotional anchors, the brain becomes more vulnerable to outside influence, more dependent on any voice that offers attention, more willing to accept guidance simply to escape the pressure of being alone with spiraling thoughts. A manipulator doesn't have to tell you what to think. They only have to ensure that no one else is there to offer an alternative. Emotional isolation intensifies self-criticism, amplifies fear, and heightens the need for approval. When someone feels unseen or unheard, even temporarily, they become far more susceptible to reassurance from the wrong source. A single person's opinion can become disproportionately powerful, shaping beliefs, decisions, and self-worth. The most chilling part is that isolation doesn't feel like a trap at first. It feels like quiet, until the quiet starts to hollow you out from the inside, leaving you grasping for connection in ways you never thought you would. Stress-Induced Compliance. Stress-induced compliance is the psychological chokehold where someone's ability to resist, question, or assert themselves collapses under pressure. When the mind is overwhelmed by tension, anxiety, or emotional strain, its defenses weaken, its judgment fogs, and its instinctive need for relief
becomes stronger than its desire for autonomy. This vulnerability is deeply unsettling because it turns the natural human response to stress into a doorway for manipulation. A stressed mind doesn't seek truth, it seeks escape, certainty, and someone who seems to have the answers. Under intense stress, the brain's survival systems take control. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning and decision-making, dims as cortisol floods the body. People become hyper-focused on alleviating the discomfort rather than evaluating the situation. A simple instruction can feel like a lifeline. A firm voice can feel like safety. A manipulator, sensing this mental collapse, can position themselves as the source of relief, offering direction, validation, or a solution that seems instantly appealing simply because it promises to end the pressure. The frightening part is that compliance under stress feels voluntary. The person believes they're making a rational choice, unaware that their brain is operating in emergency mode. This is why people agree to demands they would normally reject, why they stay silent when they want to speak, why they accept conditions that violate their boundaries. In moments of high pressure, the desire to end the stress becomes more compelling than the desire to protect oneself. Stress-induced compliance reveals a chilling truth. Even the strongest-willed individuals can be steered when their mind is drowning in tension, leaving them vulnerable to influences they would easily resist in a calmer state. Guilt loops. Guilt loops are the psychological snares that trap your mind in a cycle of self-blame, obligation, and emotional debt, keeping you stuck replaying the same painful thoughts until your sense of responsibility becomes distorted beyond recognition. They form when someone deliberately triggers guilt, subtly or overtly, and then reinforces it just enough for your mind to circle back on itself over and over, creating an emotional echo that grows louder each time it returns. The disturbing part is how guilt reshapes your perception. It makes you believe you owe something you never agreed to, that you caused harm you never intended, or that redemption requires sacrificing more than you can afford to give. Once a guilt loop takes hold, your internal dialogue shifts into relentless self-critique. You revisit the same moment repeatedly, scrutinizing your choices with increasing harshness while ignoring context, nuance, or fairness. A manipulator exploits this by reminding you of your mistakes, hinting at disappointment, or framing normal boundaries as personal failings. Every reminder reactivates the loop, reopening the wound before it has a chance to heal. You begin to apologize too quickly, compromise too easily, and accept blame too readily, believing that repairing the guilt is your responsibility, even when the guilt was engineered. What makes guilt loops so haunting is their persistence. Even in the absence of the person who triggered them, your mind continues the cycle on its own, replaying imagined accusations and punishing you with scenarios that never actually occurred. The emotional weight becomes self-sustaining, and you may find yourself begging for forgiveness where none is needed, surrendering autonomy to atone for harms that exist only in your manipulated perception. In that spiraling space, guilt becomes not a feeling, but a cage, one built from your own empathy and locked by someone who learned how to use it against you. Shame triggering. Shame triggering is the ruthless exploitation of the mind's most paralyzing emotional reflex, the instinct to shrink, self-blame, and silence oneself the moment shame is activated. Unlike guilt, which focuses on actions, shame attacks identity itself. It whispers that the problem isn't what you did, but who you are. This makes it one of the most powerful psychological levers a manipulator can pull, because once shame takes hold, the victim becomes desperate to hide, to repair, to appease, or to do anything that might lift the crushing sense of unworthiness pressing down on them. What makes shame triggering so dangerous is how quickly it transforms a strong, rational person into someone who feels small, exposed, and powerless. Shame collapses the mind inward, shutting down assertiveness and muting self-defense. A single comment, a disappointed expression, or a strategically timed accusation can ignite it. The victim's thoughts spiral, replaying flaws, imagined failures, or past wounds until the emotional weight becomes unbearable. In this state, they stop challenging the manipulator and begin questioning themselves instead, convinced they've done something wrong even when nothing happened at all. Manipulators exploit this with surgical precision. They might imply inadequacy, highlight insecurities, or weaponize past mistakes to provoke that familiar sting. Once shame floods the victim's system, compliance becomes disturbingly easy, not because the manipulator's words are convincing, but because the victim is trying to escape the emotional pain the manipulator just inflicted. The haunting part is how invisible this control can be. Shame doesn't feel like influence. It feels like self-judgment, making the victim believe they are the problem, while the real power lies in the hands of the one who knew exactly where to strike. Reward conditioning. Dependence. Reward conditioning dependence is the psychologically gripping phenomenon where your brain becomes addicted to the promise of approval, praise, or pleasure, reshaping your behavior around whoever controls the reward. Humans are wired with a powerful reinforcement system. Every compliment, every small success, every signal of acceptance releases a pulse of dopamine that feels warm, comforting, and validating. When someone learns how to control these rewards, even subtly, they gain influence over your actions without ever needing to demand anything directly. The disturbing part is how quickly the mind shifts from liking rewards to needing them, and how quietly that dependence grows. The brain begins to chase the next hit of approval, adjusting your choices, tone, and even values to maintain the flow of positive reinforcement. A withheld reward suddenly feels like rejection. A delayed one feels like punishment. You tell yourself you're acting by choice, but beneath the surface, the mind is scrambling to regain the dopamine it's been trained to crave. This rewiring is slow, invisible, and intoxicating. It makes you more compliant, more attentive, more eager to please, even when the rewards shrink or become unpredictable. Manipulators exploit this by alternating warmth with distance, praise with silence, affection with withdrawal. The inconsistency strengthens the dependence because your brain becomes obsessed with earning back what was lost. You begin to tolerate behaviors you once would have rejected, all in the desperate hope of receiving that next spark of validation. The most unsettling truth is that reward conditioning doesn't feel like control. It feels like connection, motivation, or even love, until you realize your emotions have been trained to respond to someone else's timing, leaving you chasing approval that was never freely given. Attachment exploitation. Attachment exploitation is the psychological snare that twists one of the deepest human needs, the need to bond, into a tool of control. Humans are built to attach. We crave connection, recognition, stability, and emotional resonance. When someone senses this longing, they can weaponize it, turning genuine affection into a silently tightening leash. What makes attachment exploitation so disturbing is how gentle it begins. It feels like warmth, interest, understanding, and safety. Then slowly, subtly, it shifts into dependency, vulnerability, and emotional captivity before you realize you've surrendered pieces of yourself to someone who never intended to protect them. The brain treats attachment like survival. When you bond with someone, your defenses lower and your trust heightens. Their approval feels rewarding. Their disappointment feels devastating. Manipulators use this natural wiring to build emotional addictions. They offer bursts of closeness, validation, or affection that light up your nervous system, hooking you on the feeling of being chosen. Once the attachment deepens, they begin shaping your emotions with silence, distance, or conditional attention, training your mind to chase their approval and fear their withdrawal. The terrifying part is that attachment rarely feels like manipulation while it's happening. It feels like connection. It feels like chemistry, destiny, or understanding. You begin to reinterpret your own needs through their reactions, adjusting your behavior to keep the bond intact. You excuse red flags, sacrifice boundaries, and silence doubts because the emotional tether feels too important to risk losing. Attachment exploitation reveals how profoundly the human heart can compromise itself for the sake of closeness, and how easily that longing can be redirected to serve someone else's intentions while you remain convinced you're acting out of love. Mood-Congruent Vulnerability. Mood-congruent vulnerability is the psychological phenomenon where your current emotional state quietly dictates what you notice, what you believe, and how you interpret reality, making you far more susceptible to influence when someone aligns their message with your mood. The brain is biased toward information that matches how you already feel. When you're sad, you notice losses more. When you're anxious, you see threats everywhere. When you're hopeful, you trust too easily. This automatic filtering is meant to help you make sense of the world, but it becomes a dangerous opening the moment someone deliberately mirrors or reinforces your emotional state to slip past your defenses. In this vulnerable state, the world feels as if it's confirming your emotions, when in reality, it's your emotions shaping what you perceive. A manipulator takes advantage of this by amplifying whatever feeling already dominates you. If you're stressed, they highlight risks. If you're lonely, they emphasize connection. If you're angry, they stoke outrage. Because their words match your mood, they feel true. So true that questioning them feels unnatural. You're not persuaded through logic. You're persuaded through resonance, as if the other person is simply voicing what you were already thinking, even if those thoughts were planted. The unsettling part is that mood-congruent vulnerability doesn't just influence your judgments, it rewrites them. Once your emotional state locks into place, your brain selectively gathers evidence that supports the feeling, ignoring anything that contradicts it. A manipulator doesn't need to control your mind. They only need to control your mood. In that moment, your perception shifts to accommodate the emotion, and the person who mirrors it becomes the one who feels most trustworthy, even when their intentions are anything but. Uncertainty-Induced Surrender. Uncertainty-induced surrender is the psychological collapse that happens when a person becomes so overwhelmed by doubt, confusion, or conflicting information that their mind instinctively gives up its autonomy and clings to whoever appears confident. Humans are wired to fear the unknown. Uncertainty activates the same survival circuitry that warns of danger. When that uncertainty becomes relentless, when answers blur, outcomes shift, and nothing feels solid, the brain reaches a breaking point. It begins searching not for truth, but for relief. A manipulator weaponizes this by creating an environment where the victim can't find clarity, leaving them mentally disoriented, emotionally unanchored, and desperate for direction. In this state, the victim becomes frighteningly vulnerable. When a person no longer trusts their own judgment, they will accept someone else's. The manipulator may alternate between mixed messages, shifting expectations, or subtle contradictions that keep the victim perpetually off balance. Each moment of doubt erodes confidence further until the victim can't tell what's real, what's exaggerated, or what's imagined. Their inner voice grows quieter while the manipulator's voice grows louder, not because it's logical, but because it feels like the only stable point in the chaos. The emotional impact is devastating. The mind trapped in uncertainty begins to crave certainty the way a starving person craves food. Even false certainty feels comforting. The victim might agree to things they wouldn't normally consider, follow instructions they don't fully understand, or silence concerns just to escape the unbearable tension of not knowing what to believe. The most haunting part is that uncertainty
Induced surrender doesn't feel like being controlled. It feels like being rescued, even though the rescuer is the one who created the confusion in the first place.
Identity fragmentation pressure. Identity fragmentation pressure is the deeply disturbing psychological force that begins when someone subtly pulls apart the different pieces of who you are, your beliefs, your roles, your values, your memories, until the coherent sense of self you once relied on starts to fracture. The human mind depends on a stable identity to navigate the world. It is the anchor that tells you what to trust, what to fear, what to pursue, and what to walk away from. When that anchor is loosened, even slightly, your thoughts grow unsteady. You begin questioning your own preferences, doubting your instincts, and feeling strangely disconnected from the person you used to be. Fragmentation doesn't happen loudly. It begins as a quiet internal trembling. A manipulator will often target these cracks with precision. They may challenge your confidence in one area while praising another, creating a subtle imbalance inside you. Suddenly, you feel strong in one moment and strangely hollow in the next. They introduce contradictions about who you are, making you feel like you need their perspective to interpret yourself correctly. Over time, the self-image you've spent years building becomes blurry, disjointed, and frighteningly malleable. You start relying on external cues, often from the very person applying the pressure, to tell you what kind of person you are. The chilling part is that fragmentation feels like confusion rather than manipulation. You don't think you're losing your identity. You think you're figuring things out, even as pieces of you drift apart. When your internal compass weakens, you become far more vulnerable to influence, validation, and direction from any voice that offers certainty. Identity doesn't shatter in one moment. It dissolves slowly, leaving you reaching for clarity that no longer comes from within. Learned helplessness. Pathways. Learned helplessness pathways are the psychological trapdoors that form when a person is repeatedly made to feel powerless until their mind stops trying to escape. It is the gradual erosion of hope, agency, and initiative built through experiences where every effort seems to fail, every attempt is dismissed, and every small act of resistance is met with defeat. The terrifying part is not the helplessness itself. It is how the brain adapts to it. Over time, the mind internalizes failure so deeply that even when freedom or solutions appear, the person no longer believes they are capable of reaching them. The human psyche is wired to search for patterns. When the pattern is nothing you do matters, the brain rewires itself into a state of surrender. Cortisol rises, motivation fades, and the nervous system begins to conserve energy by giving up before a challenge even begins. This state becomes familiar, numbing, almost safe in its predictability. The person stops fighting not because the situation is impossible, but because they've been conditioned to believe that effort is pointless. That belief becomes its own prison. Manipulators exploit this by creating cycles of frustration, failure, or emotional punishment. They shift the rules, invalidate attempts, and deny small victories until the person's confidence collapses. Once the helplessness pathway is formed, obedience becomes effortless. The victim stays where they are, not because they want to, but because their mind can no longer imagine movement. What makes learned helplessness so haunting is how thoroughly it convinces someone that they are trapped even long after the cage has been opened, turning psychological scars into invisible chains that restrain them from reclaiming their power. Ego fatigue exploitation. Ego fatigue exploitation takes advantage of the moment when your mental strength has been slowly worn down to the point where your ability to resist, evaluate, or assert yourself collapses. The human mind has a limited pool of self-control, decision-making energy, and emotional endurance. When that pool runs low after repeated stress, long conversations, constant decision-making, or subtle pressure,
your defenses weaken dramatically. That is the moment a manipulator waits for, when your clarity dissolves and your boundaries become soft enough to reshape. What makes this so disturbing is that ego fatigue doesn't feel like exhaustion. It feels like you're simply being reasonable, when in reality, your resistance is eroding beneath you. As ego fatigue sets in, your thoughts become slower, your patience thinner, your ability to say no weaker. You become more agreeable, not because you want to be, but because the effort required to push back feels impossibly heavy. A manipulator gently nudges you toward this state by overwhelming you with choices, prolonging discussions, introducing emotional turbulence, or creating small conflicts that force you to repeatedly self-regulate. Each moment drains a little more of your mental energy until finally you surrender, not out of conviction, but out of depletion. This vulnerability intensifies when the situation feels urgent or emotionally charged. You tell yourself you're compromising to keep the peace, to be fair, or to avoid conflict, unaware that your depleted state is guiding your decisions. Ego fatigue exploitation works not by overpowering you, but by waiting for you to wear yourself down. By the time you realize how deeply your boundaries have been pushed, the exhaustion has already convinced you that resisting is harder than simply giving in, leaving you exposed in the one moment your mind least belongs to you. Belief erosion. Belief erosion is the gradual dismantling of a person's inner certainty, an insidious psychological process where long-held convictions, values, and self-truths are weakened not through direct attack, but through subtle, persistent pressure that makes them crumble from within. The human mind depends on stable beliefs to feel grounded. They form identity, guide decisions, and give life coherence. When those beliefs begin to erode, a person doesn't just lose ideas, they lose pieces of themselves. What makes belief erosion so disturbing is that it rarely happens through a single dramatic moment. It happens through whispers, doubts, contradictions, and emotional nudges that slowly reshape the foundation of someone's reality. A manipulator initiates this erosion by introducing small cracks, gentle questions that imply flaw, quiet contradictions that make the victim second guess, or repeated reminders that their beliefs are outdated, naive, or irrational. Each seed of doubt seems harmless on its own, but the brain collects them. Over time, the victim begins confronting the uncomfortable feeling that their once solid truths don't feel as stable anymore. The manipulator reinforces this by offering alternative beliefs wrapped in confidence, superiority, or emotional validation, creating a psychological contrast between the victim's weakening foundation and the manipulator's unwavering stance. As doubt grows, the victim starts relying on the manipulator for clarity, guidance, and interpretation. The original beliefs, moral boundaries, personal standards, self-worth start dissolving subtly, replaced by new narratives that feel like revelations, but are actually engineered dependencies. The emotional toll is profound. People experiencing belief erosion often feel lost, fragmented, or ashamed of no longer trusting what they once knew. The most haunting part is that by the time they realize their identity has shifted, the erosion has already carved deep enough that they can no longer remember who they were before the breaking began. Identity switch reinforcement is the unnerving psychological tactic where someone subtly encourages you to adopt a version of yourself that benefits their agenda, not yours, and then rewards you whenever you act in alignment with that constructed identity. Humans naturally shift between different roles depending on the environment. Confident in one setting, unsure in another, bold with one person, quiet with someone else. This fluidity becomes a point of vulnerability when someone intentionally shapes, praises, and reinforces a specific version of you until that version begins to feel more real than your authentic self. The manipulation doesn't start with pressure, it starts with validation.
The moment you display a trait they want, submissiveness, compliance, dependency, loyalty, they highlight it, praise it, or emotionally reward it. Your brain lights up with approval, making that trait feel safe, valued, and right. When you behave in ways that don't align with the identity they want for you, they withdraw that warmth, offering subtle disappointment or cool detachment. Over time, you begin gravitating toward the reinforced identity without realizing you're drifting away from the person you actually are. What once felt like a mask starts to feel like home. This tactic becomes even more chilling because the identity you're being pushed toward often feels strangely empowering at first. You think you're growing, changing, or discovering yourself, unaware that the transformation is being engineered by someone who benefits from your shift. You start speaking differently, reacting differently, choosing differently, all while believing these changes are self-directed. The most disturbing part is how invisible the reinforcement becomes. You don't feel controlled, you feel seen, understood, even encouraged, until one day you realize the identity you've grown into wasn't born from your own desires, but sculpted from someone else's expectations, quietly replacing pieces of who you used to be. Contradictory information overload. Contradictory information overload is the psychological ambush where the mind is bombarded with clashing details, opposing claims, and inconsistent narratives until its ability to think clearly collapses under the weight of confusion. The human brain is built to seek patterns and coherence. It craves a single, stable version of reality. When that stability is shattered by too many conflicting inputs, the mind begins to panic quietly. It scrambles for clarity, grasps at whatever seems simplest, and becomes vulnerable to the one voice that appears confident amid the chaos. The unsettling truth is that confusion doesn't remain neutral. It creates an emotional vacuum that someone else can fill. When exposed to layers of contradictions, the brain experiences cognitive overload. Doubt spreads, certainty dissolves. The person feels mentally disoriented, caught between incompatible truths, unsure which direction to trust. As internal tension rises, the mind becomes desperate for relief, for something to cut through the noise. This desperation is precisely where manipulation thrives. The individual becomes far more willing to accept a simplified explanation, even if it's false, merely because it offers the comfort of certainty. Manipulators exploit this by flooding someone with too much information or constantly shifting their stories. They introduce contradictions not to deceive outright but to destabilize. They know that a confused mind clings to clarity wherever it can find it. Once the person becomes exhausted from trying to piece everything together, they often abandon their own judgment and defer to the source that seems most composed. Contradictory information overload reveals how the mind, when pushed into chaos, reaches for the nearest anchor, even if that anchor is the very hand that created the storm. Imposter syndrome induction. Imposter syndrome induction is the calculated manipulation of a person's deepest insecurities, engineered to make them doubt their competence, question their accomplishments, and ultimately feel unworthy of their own success. It preys on the fragile space between confidence and self-critique, exploiting the human tendency to compare, underestimate, and second-guess. The unsettling part is how easily this psychological trap can be planted. A subtle comment, a raised eyebrow, a strategically timed praise of someone else, or a faint suggestion that you just got lucky. These small fractures grow into a massive internal echo, convincing you that you're a fraud waiting to be exposed. When imposter syndrome takes hold, your mind becomes your tormentor. Achievements feel like accidents, compliments feel undeserved, and every minor mistake feels like proof that you're faking your way through life. A manipulator exploits this distorted thinking by reinforcing the idea that you are out of your depth, slowly making you dependent on their validation to feel competent. Every doubt you express becomes fuel for their control. They highlight your flaws, downplay your strengths, and position themselves as the one who truly sees your limitations, guiding your confidence downward until you no longer trust your own judgment. What makes this tactic so haunting is that the attack doesn't come from the outside. It begins to speak through your own voice. You start censoring yourself, shrinking your ambitions, and apologizing for existing in spaces you earned your way into. The manipulator no longer needs to plant new doubts. Your mind does the work for them, and in that vulnerable state, you become far easier to influence, not because you lack ability, but because you've been convinced that everything you've earned could crumble the moment someone realizes who you really are. Approval, dependence, conditioning. Approval, dependence, conditioning is the gradual reshaping of a person's behavior, self-worth, and identity around the constant need for someone else's validation. It begins subtly, small compliments, gentle praise, moments of warmth delivered with perfect timing, until the victim's emotional system becomes rewired to crave that approval like oxygen. Humans are built to seek acceptance. It's embedded in our survival instincts. But when a manipulator learns how to control the flow of approval, they gain the power to dictate how someone feels, thinks, and acts. The terrifying part is how invisible this conditioning can be, because it disguises itself as affection, support, or encouragement. The manipulator doesn't give approval freely. They give it strategically. Behaviors they want to encourage are rewarded with attention, affection, or praise. Behaviors they want to suppress are met with silence, withdrawal, or subtle disappointment. The victim begins adjusting themselves unconsciously, choosing the path that brings approval and avoiding anything that risks losing it. Over time, their independent desires fade, replaced by a growing anxiety around pleasing the manipulator and avoiding emotional coldness. This conditioning becomes brutally effective when the victim is emotionally vulnerable or has a history of craving acceptance. Each hit of approval feels euphoric. Each withdrawal feels devastating. The brain develops a reward cycle, turning the manipulator's reactions into the governing force behind choices, opinions, and even personality traits. The victim starts asking themselves, will they like this? Before asking, do I want this? The most chilling element is that approval dependence doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like wanting to be better for someone, unaware that the better they're chasing is nothing more than the version of themselves the manipulator finds easiest to control. Crisis-driven personality shifts. Crisis-driven personality shifts occur when a person, under intense emotional, psychological, or situational pressure, temporarily becomes someone they barely recognize. More compliant, more impulsive, more submissive, more erratic, or more dependent than they ever would be in a calm state. In moments of crisis, the brain abandons its usual identity patterns and survival instincts take over, reshaping thoughts and behaviors in ways that feel instinctive but are frighteningly malleable. This makes a person shockingly vulnerable because the self they operate from during crisis is not the same self that would normally make decisions, set boundaries, or question motives. In a crisis, the mind scrambles for safety, clarity, or immediate relief. Fight or flight surges through the body, narrowing attention and shutting down long-term thinking. Suddenly, things that once felt unreasonable or unacceptable become strangely tolerable if they promise quick stability. A manipulator who steps in at that exact moment, offering guidance, comfort, or solutions, can quietly wedge themselves into the shifting personality landscape. Their influence doesn't need to be forceful. The crisis itself has already softened the psyche, making suggestions feel like lifelines and demands feel like necessities. What makes this phenomenon so disturbing is how genuine the shifted personality feels from the inside. You don't think you're being influenced. You think you're doing what you have to do, being strong or handling things differently now.
but the crisis-created version of you is shaped by fear, urgency, and psychological exhaustion, and its choices often contradict the values and instincts of your true self. When the crisis passes, you may look back in disbelief at the person you became, unable to fully explain how your boundaries slipped, why you agreed to things you never would have before, or how someone else gained access to you at your most altered and exposed. External validation addiction. External validation addiction is the psychological snare where a person's sense of worth becomes so dependent on others' approval that their identity begins to fracture without it. Humans naturally seek recognition. It reassures us that we matter, that we belong, that we are seen. But when validation becomes a requirement rather than a comfort, the mind starts to reorganize itself around one consuming need: to be affirmed by someone outside of you. What makes this so disturbing is how quietly it forms. A compliment here, a nod of approval there, and slowly your brain begins to chase the emotional high, reshaping your behavior to earn that next hit of acceptance. The mind reacts to approval like a reward. Dopamine surges, anxiety fades, a temporary sense of worth blooms. The brain learns that value isn't something you hold, it's something you must earn through others. Over time, you begin tailoring yourself to whatever gains the most positive response. You silence parts of your personality, mimic expectations, and abandon your own desires to maintain that fragile sense of being good enough. Without approval, you feel hollow, insecure, almost defective. With it, you feel alive. Manipulators exploit this dependency by becoming the main supplier of validation. They offer praise selectively, withholding it when they want control and granting it when they want compliance. Your sense of self becomes tied to their reactions, making their approval feel essential and their disapproval devastating. You shift your choices, opinions, and even your values to keep that emotional lifeline intact. External validation addiction reveals how easily a person can lose themselves when their worth becomes something borrowed, something handed to them only when it serves someone else's agenda, leaving them terrified of disappointing the very voices that quietly dismantle their identity. Confirmation bias, manipulation. Confirmation bias manipulation is the calculated use of your mind's craving for certainty to steer you toward beliefs, choices, or conclusions that benefit someone else, all while making you feel completely convinced that you arrived there on your own. The human brain is wired to search for evidence that supports what it already believes, because agreement feels safe and contradiction feels threatening. This instinct, meant to protect you from cognitive overload, becomes a dangerous vulnerability the moment someone learns how to feed you the exact information that aligns with your existing assumptions. The unsettling truth is that once your beliefs feel validated, your mind stops looking for the truth and starts reinforcing the illusion. When a manipulator exploits confirmation bias, they don't argue with you. They agree with you just enough to open the door. They echo your concerns, mirror your fears, amplify your suspicions, and then gently guide you to conclusions that you were already halfway convinced of. Because their message fits the narrative in your mind, it bypasses scrutiny. You don't question their motives, their accuracy, or their intentions. Instead, you feel understood, supported, and justified. And in that emotional comfort, your critical thinking dissolves. What makes this tactic so terrifying is how easily you can become trapped in a self-made echo chamber without ever realizing it. You'll begin collecting proof that aligns with the belief they encouraged, discarding anything that doesn't fit. The manipulator no longer needs to control the narrative once your own mind begins filtering reality to match the story. Soon, your world becomes shaped not by objective truth, but by the selective pieces fed to you at the perfect moment, making you believe that the conclusion wasn't planted, it was inevitable. Availability bias. Triggering. Availability bias triggering
is the exploitation of the brain's tendency to treat whatever is most vivid, recent, or emotionally charged as far more important than it actually is. Instead of evaluating reality objectively, the mind latches onto the easiest memories to access, images that shocked you, stories that scared you, moments that hurt you, and uses them as the default lens for judgment. A manipulator knows this instinct well. They don't need to change your beliefs with evidence. They only need to make certain ideas louder, more dramatic, or more emotionally loaded than the quiet truths hiding beneath them. The terrifying part is that once an idea becomes mentally available, the brain mistakes familiarity for probability, turning isolated moments into seemingly universal truths. This hack works because the brain saves energy by relying on shortcuts. It assumes what comes to mind quickly must be meaningful. When a manipulator repeatedly brings up frightening possibilities, dramatic examples, or emotionally charged scenarios, they saturate the victim's mental landscape with a single narrative. Suddenly, rare risks feel common, isolated conflicts feel constant, and exaggerated dangers feel imminent. The victim begins reacting not to what's real, but to what's easiest to remember. Memories planted by repetition and emotional intensity. Under stress, this effect intensifies. The mind becomes even more dependent on these quick access memories, ignoring quieter facts that require more effort to recall. A manipulator exploits this by ensuring the victim's emotional memory bank is filled with carefully curated moments, steering their decisions through fear, guilt, or urgency. The victim ends up trusting the memory that screams the loudest, unaware that its volume was artificially amplified, drowning out the truth hiding in the background. Framing effect, exploitation framing. Effect exploitation is the unsettling psychological tactic where someone reshapes your perception of a situation not by changing the facts, but by changing the angle from which those facts are presented. The human mind doesn't interpret reality objectively. It interprets reality through emotional lenses, and those lenses can be manipulated with a few carefully chosen words. A situation can feel safe or dangerous, generous or selfish, wise or reckless, depending solely on how it's framed. This makes the framing effect one of the most quietly powerful forms of influence, because it changes not what you think, but how you feel about what you think. When someone exploits framing, they choose language that steers your judgment before you even have a chance to analyze the information. A risk becomes an opportunity. A loss becomes an investment. A demand becomes a favor. A threat becomes concern. The brain reacts emotionally to the frame first and only afterward tries to reason through the content. But by then, the emotional tone has already shaped your interpretation. You believe you're thinking logically, not realizing you're trapped inside a narrative built to push you toward a predetermined conclusion. Framing becomes especially dangerous when it's used to soften harm or amplify fear. A manipulator may portray their behavior as protective rather than controlling, or describe alternatives as risky, selfish, or irresponsible. The emotional impact of the frame warps your internal compass, making harmful choices seem necessary and healthy choices seem reckless. The chilling reality is that framing doesn't fight your beliefs, it gently twists the context around them until you find yourself agreeing with ideas you would have rejected instantly if they had been presented without their carefully constructed emotional packaging. Projection reinforcement is the psychological distortion where someone subtly encourages you to accept their assumptions, fears, or insecurities as your own by reflecting them back at you until they feel undeniable. Projection itself is when a person attributes their inner conflicts to someone else, but reinforcement takes this further. It is the deliberate act of nudging you to internalize those projected traits, slowly convincing you that their interpretation of you is reality. The chilling part is how easily the human mind absorbs external definitions especially when spoken with confidence or emotional intensity. The brain is vulnerable to identity cues. When someone repeatedly tells you what you're thinking, what you meant, or who you are, a part of your mind wants to believe them simply because identity is complex and self-awareness is fragile. If they say you're jealous, defensive, selfish, or untrustworthy enough times, the repetition starts to harden into something that feels like truth, even when it isn't. Doubt forms. You question your intentions. You begin defending yourself, and in doing so, you subtly accept the premise that their projection deserves justification. Manipulators weaponize projection reinforcement by making their insecurities your supposed flaws. They accuse you of their own motives, then interpret every reaction you have as proof they were right. They twist your silence into guilt, your confusion into deception, your calm into indifference. Each claim plants another seed, and each seed grows into a crack in your self-perception. The terrifying aspect is how quickly the mind can bend under repeated accusation. Over time, you start reacting to the projected identity as if it were truly yours, defending yourself from shadows that never belonged to you, and carrying emotional weight that originated in someone else's unresolved turmoil. Illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect is the unsettling psychological phenomenon where repetition turns fiction into perceived fact, allowing someone to reshape your beliefs simply by exposing you to the same statement over and over until your mind stops questioning it. The human brain is wired for cognitive efficiency, and familiarity feels safer than scrutiny. When information repeats, whether through conversation, media, or subtle hints, the mind begins to accept it, not because it's true, but because it feels increasingly recognizable. The disturbing part is how silently this shift happens. You don't feel persuaded. You feel like you remember something that was never real. When someone exploits the illusory truth effect, they don't need evidence or logic. They only need consistency. A manipulator can drip the same idea into your awareness through casual remarks, jokes, warnings, or stories, each repetition softening your resistance. Even when you know the claim is questionable, hearing it again and again creates a sense of cognitive ease. Your brain mistakes that ease for accuracy. Doubt fades. Familiarity wins. This vulnerability becomes dangerously powerful when combined with emotional triggers. If the repeated message stirs fear, hope, resentment, or validation, the mind embraces it even faster. Over time, you may begin defending these implanted truths, convinced they are your own conclusions. The repetition doesn't just influence your beliefs, it rewires your perception of reality. You forget where the idea came from, only remembering that it feels right. What makes the illusory truth effect so haunting is that it doesn't require force, skill, or authority. It only requires patience. A carefully crafted lie, repeated often enough, eventually becomes indistinguishable from memory itself, leaving you certain of something that was manufactured from the very beginning. Bandwagon fallacy, exploitation. Bandwagon fallacies. Exploitation is the psychological manipulation that takes root when someone convinces you that an idea must be right, simply because everyone else supposedly believes it. Humans are social beings wired to avoid standing alone, and the fear of isolation runs deeper than most people admit. When faced with the possibility of being the outsider, the brain often abandons skepticism in favor of belonging. A manipulator weaponizes this instinct by manufacturing the illusion of overwhelming agreement, creating a pressure so subtle yet so powerful that the victim feels compelled to join the tide, no matter where it leads. What makes this tactic so dangerous is how quickly it shuts down independent thought. When a person hears that everybody knows, everyone agrees, or everyone is doing it, their mind instinctively shifts from evaluating truth to avoiding risk. Dissent starts to feel embarrassing, irrational, or even unsafe. The manipulator doesn't need facts. They only need the appearance of a crowd. A few strategically placed stories, a couple of rehearsed examples, or a falsely confident tone is enough to create the illusion of consensus. Once that illusion sinks in, the victim begins doubting their own judgment, trading their instincts for the comfort of conformity. This effect intensifies when emotions run high. If the crowd seems enthusiastic, the victim feels the pull to match that excitement. If the crowd seems outraged, they fear becoming the target. The manipulator counts on this emotional contagion, guiding the victim toward beliefs or actions they would never have chosen alone. The unsettling truth is that the bandwagon fallacy doesn't require a real crowd at all, only the suggestion of one, strong enough to silence the voice inside that dares to question. Halo effect manipulation. Halo effect manipulation is the unnerving psychological tactic where someone leverages a single positive trait, charm, attractiveness, confidence, intelligence, status, to distort your perception of everything else about them. The brain, desperate to simplify the world, uses one shining characteristic as a shortcut, assuming that if a person excels in one area, they must excel in others. Manipulators weaponize this instinct by elevating one carefully chosen quality and letting your mind do the rest of the work, painting them as more trustworthy, more kind, more capable, or more moral than they truly are. The most disturbing part is how automatic and unconscious this distortion is. You don't just admire them, you idealize them. Once the halo takes hold, every action passes through its glow. Red flags become misunderstandings. Inconsistencies become quirks. Harmful behavior becomes stress, bad timing, or just how they are. Your brain filters out contradictions because it's trying to protect the positive image it's already invested in. The manipulator doesn't need to hide who they are. They only need to shine brightly in one area and let your perception blur the rest. The halo becomes an emotional shield, blocking your ability to see them clearly. This effect intensifies when the admired trait hits one of your personal vulnerabilities, your longing for approval, attraction, mentorship, or validation. The single trait becomes a gravitational pull, drawing you into their orbit, making you justify their actions while ignoring your instincts. You don't realize the manipulation is happening because the halo doesn't feel like influence. It feels like admiration, inspiration, even destiny. And that illusion is powerful enough to blind you to truths you would never miss in anyone who didn't shine quite so brightly. Negativity bias triggering. Negativity bias triggering is the psychological lever that exploits the mind's instinctive obsession with danger, loss, and criticism. Humans are wired to prioritize negative information because throughout evolution, the cost of ignoring a threat was far greater than missing out on something good. But this ancient survival instinct becomes a weapon when someone deliberately activates it, feeding your mind a steady stream of warnings, doubts, and worst-case scenarios until your perception tilts toward fear. The disturbing part is how instantly the brain latches onto negativity, treating even minor threats as urgent truths while dismissing anything that offers reassurance or balance. When negativity is triggered, the mind enters hypervigilance. You become more sensitive to mistakes, more reactive to tone, more alert to disappointment. One criticism can outweigh 100 compliments. A single risk can overshadow dozens of possibilities. This shift isn't rational, it's neurological. Negative stimuli activate stronger neural responses than positive ones, pulling emotions into darker territory even when the situation doesn't warrant it. Once the bias is awakened, it colors everything you see. Manipulators use this vulnerability with eerie precision. They highlight flaws, amplify dangers, and remind you of every possible failure until your confidence fractures. They frame neutral events as threats and twist uncertainties into looming catastrophes. Bit by bit, they mold your mindset into one
where fear feels like truth and doubt feels like wisdom. You start bracing for the worst even when nothing is wrong. You overanalyze every interaction. You become dependent on the person who keeps you in a state of tension, seeking clarity from the very voice fueling your anxiety. Negativity bias triggering reveals how fragile the mind becomes when fear is constantly activated, turning even ordinary moments into shadows that follow you long after the initial spark has passed. Zero-risk bias. Manipulation. Zero-risk bias. Manipulation exploits the mind's deep desire for absolute safety, pushing you toward decisions that feel secure, even when they quietly strip away your freedom, resources, or better opportunities. Humans instinctively gravitate toward choices that eliminate risk entirely, even if that safety comes at a greater hidden cost. This ancient survival instinct becomes a psychological vulnerability the moment someone frames their preferred option as the only path with no danger, no downside, or no consequences. The disturbing truth is that absolute safety almost never exists, yet the illusion of it can override logic with terrifying ease. When zero-risk bias is triggered, your fear of uncertainty intensifies. You become fixated on removing discomfort rather than evaluating long-term outcomes. A manipulator exploits this by painting a vivid picture of what could go wrong if you choose anything other than the option they're offering. They magnify hypothetical dangers, highlight rare worst-case scenarios, and emphasize how their path avoids them all. Your brain, desperate for relief, clings to that illusion of total protection, even if it means accepting a solution that limits you far more than the risk ever would have. This tactic becomes especially powerful when you're already anxious, uncertain, or overwhelmed. In that fragile state, a risk-free option feels like a lifeline. You don't stop to question what you're trading away in exchange for that comfort. You don't notice the shrinking boundaries, the subtle control, the narrowing of choices. You only notice the relief of avoiding danger, and that relief becomes its own trap. The haunting part is that once zero-risk bias takes hold, you may willingly surrender autonomy, not because you trust the person influencing you, but because your fear of any risk, no matter how small, becomes louder than your ability to think clearly. Status quo manipulation. Status quo manipulation is the psychological maneuver that takes advantage of the mind's deep craving for familiarity, predictability, and emotional safety. People naturally cling to what feels known, even if the familiar is harmful, limiting, or irrational, because the brain interprets change as risk. A manipulator exploits this instinct by convincing the victim that staying exactly where they are is the safest, smartest, and most responsible choice. This tactic doesn't require pressure or threats. It simply feeds the quiet fear of the unknown until the victim becomes paralyzed, choosing stagnation over possibility without realizing they've been guided there. The power of status quo manipulation lies in subtle reinforcement. The manipulator frames alternatives as too stressful, too uncertain, too disruptive. They highlight every potential downside of change while glorifying the comfort of what already exists. Their voice becomes the echo of the victim's own anxieties. Why complicate things? What if it gets worse? Things aren't that bad. Each suggestion chips away at ambition, curiosity, and critical thought until remaining in place feels like the only rational choice. Emotion intensifies this effect. When someone is tired, scared, overwhelmed, or unsure, the brain retreats to the familiar automatically. A manipulator counts on this, presenting change as chaos and the status quo as sanctuary. The victim slowly begins to believe that moving forward is dangerous, stepping back is failure, and staying still is wisdom. What makes status quo manipulation so disturbing is how invisible it is. It doesn't force compliance. It convinces the victim to stop moving on their own. The prison isn't built with threats or commands,
but with comfort, doubt, and the quiet, suffocating belief that nothing safer exists beyond the boundaries already around them. Gaslighting is the deeply disorienting psychological assault where someone intentionally distorts your perception of reality until you begin doubting your own memories, emotions, and sanity. It doesn't start as a direct attack. It begins as subtle contradictions, gentle corrections, and small denials that seem harmless in isolation. But each moment is designed to loosen your grip on your own truth. Over time, the manipulator becomes the interpreter of your reality, while your once stable sense of self erodes beneath a growing fog of uncertainty. What makes gaslighting so terrifying is not the lies themselves, but the way they make you question everything you once trusted about your own mind. At first, you feel confused, then embarrassed, then dependent. When your memory is challenged enough times, when your feelings are dismissed often enough, when your instincts are ridiculed repeatedly, the brain begins to surrender its confidence. You start apologizing for things that aren't your fault. You rewrite memories to match their version. You doubt moments you lived through, emotions you felt, and words you clearly heard. The manipulator builds a world where they're always right, and you're always mistaken, unstable, or overreacting. Gaslighting becomes especially dangerous when wrapped in affection, calmness, or concern. The manipulator may claim they're helping you, protecting you, or keeping you grounded, all while subtly unraveling your sense of reality. And the more destabilized you feel, the more power they gain. Because once you stop trusting your own mind, you have no choice but to trust theirs. The chilling truth is that gaslighting doesn't just distort your memory, it rewires your sense of self, leaving you lost in a reality someone else constructed while you struggle to remember the moment your own internal compass began to break. False consensus creation. False consensus creation is the psychological illusion where someone convinces you that their opinion, preference, or perspective is shared by everyone, tricking your mind into believing you're the outlier for thinking differently. Humans fear isolation, both socially and mentally. The idea of standing alone against a majority, real or fabricated, triggers discomfort, powerful enough to override independent judgment. This vulnerability becomes dangerous when someone deliberately manufactures the appearance of widespread agreement to pressure you into conformity. The unsettling part is how quickly the mind surrenders its stance when it believes it is standing against a collective. When you hear phrases like, "everyone knows," "nobody else thinks that," or "people agree," your brain interprets them as social evidence, even when no evidence exists. The mind is naturally biased toward belonging, so it leans toward what it perceives as the majority viewpoint. Repeated suggestions of consensus create a mental shortcut that bypasses skepticism. You begin questioning your own thoughts, assuming that if so many others disagree, you must be the one who's mistaken. Manipulators use this tactic by crafting a phantom crowd around their ideas. They reference unnamed groups, imply collective judgment, or cite fabricated examples to make their stance feel universally accepted. Once you internalize this illusion, your resistance softens, doubt creeps in, you hesitate to voice your perspective, you adjust yourself to avoid being the odd one out, never realizing the majority exists only in the manipulator's words. False consensus creation reveals how easily the mind trades authenticity for the comforting lie of belonging, reshaping your values, beliefs, and decisions around a crowd that may never have existed in the first place. Reality filter narrowing is the manipulation of your perception by gradually restricting the information your mind considers relevant until your entire worldview is shaped by a small, curated slice of reality that someone else has chosen for you. The human brain cannot process everything at once. It relies on mental filters to decide what matters and what can be safely ignored. But when those filters are subtly guided, weakened, or reshaped, the world you think you see becomes only a controlled fraction of what actually exists. The chilling part is how effortlessly this can happen, because your mind mistakes efficiency for truth. What you focus on becomes your reality, and what you never see stops existing in your awareness. When someone narrows your reality filter, they don't need to lie. They only need to highlight certain details while downplaying or omitting others. A few strategic reminders, repeated framings, or emotional cues can convince your mind to elevate specific perspectives and discard conflicting ones. Over time, your perception becomes a funnel, wide at the top, suffocatingly narrow at the bottom, filtering out anything that doesn't fit the narrative you've been guided toward. You begin to think you're making objective judgments, when in truth you're choosing from a distorted menu of thoughts that no longer reflect the full picture. This vulnerability becomes frighteningly potent during stress, conflict, or uncertainty, when the brain clings to simplicity. A manipulator can quietly remove nuance, eliminate context, and spotlight selective evidence until your inner world shrinks around the story they want you to believe. And because the narrowing happens gradually, you rarely feel it happening. You simply wake up one day convinced that your beliefs form naturally, never realizing how much of reality was quietly filtered out before you ever had a chance to see it. Contradiction overload. Contradiction overload is the psychological breakdown that occurs when someone is bombarded with opposing statements, shifting expectations, and incompatible messages until their mind can no longer hold on to a stable sense of truth. Humans are wired to seek coherence. The brain needs consistency to feel safe and to understand the world. When confronted with too many contradictions, especially delivered rapidly or emotionally, the conscious mind struggles to reconcile them. The result is a mental fog where confusion replaces clarity, doubt replaces confidence, and the victim becomes desperate for someone to offer a version of reality that finally makes sense. A manipulator exploits this desperation by creating the very chaos they later claim to resolve. The tactic works because contradiction generates cognitive strain. When the brain hears two incompatible ideas, it instinctively tries to resolve them. But when contradictions multiply, the mind becomes overwhelmed, unable to process or prioritize which truth to believe. The victim begins questioning their memory, perception, and judgment. Each new conflicting message destabilizes them further until their ability to challenge anything weakens. In this disoriented state, people often cling to the source of the contradictions, hoping for clarity, unaware that clarity is being withheld intentionally. Emotion makes contradiction overload especially potent. Fear, guilt, or urgency accelerate the confusion, pushing the mind into survival mode where logic collapses. The manipulator might alternate between praise and criticism, warmth and coldness, promises and threats, kindness and cruelty. Each emotional contradiction fractures the victim's ability to predict what comes next, nurturing dependence and compliance. The most disturbing part is that contradiction overload doesn't just distort truth, it erodes the victim's trust in their own mental stability. Once a person no longer trusts their internal compass, they become frighteningly easy to guide, even if every direction they receive is a contradiction of the last. Normalization of deviance. Normalization of deviance is the unsettling psychological drift where repeated exposure to wrongdoing, danger, or boundary violations slowly makes the unacceptable feel ordinary. It doesn't happen in a single shocking moment. It happens in small, almost invisible increments. A minor breach becomes not a big deal. A slightly worse one becomes just how things are. And before you realize what has happened, your internal alarm system has been rewired to treat deviance as normal, familiar, even expected. The true horror of this phenomenon is that the mind adapts to dysfunction far faster than it realizes, reshaping your moral and emotional thresholds without ever asking your permission. Each time a deviation goes unchallenged, the brain reduces its sensitivity to the behavior, telling itself that if it didn't cause immediate catastrophe, it must be safe. This creates a dangerous cycle. The more a rule is bent, the easier it becomes to bend it further. A manipulator, abuser, or controlling figure exploits this by escalating slowly, never enough to trigger your defenses in one blow, but always enough to shift your baseline. What once would have shocked you becomes tolerable. What once felt intolerable becomes familiar. The environment doesn't suddenly become dangerous. You simply stop noticing the danger. Normalization of deviance becomes especially haunting when tied to emotional relationships or high-stakes environments. Because humans crave stability, the brain will justify nearly anything to maintain psychological continuity. You begin rewriting your own expectations, convincing yourself that this is just how things work, even when everything inside you knows it shouldn't be. The deviance doesn't just become normal, it becomes the new definition of reality, leaving you unable to trace the moment your boundaries began to dissolve into silence. Distorted feedback loops. Distorted feedback loops are the psychological traps where your sense of reality becomes shaped not by your own experiences, but by someone else's carefully engineered reactions to your behavior. Humans rely on feedback to understand themselves. Approval, disapproval, tone, expression, silence. These signals teach us what is acceptable, what is valued, what is rejected. But when the feedback you receive is intentionally warped, inconsistent, or strategically delivered, your internal compass begins to malfunction. What makes distorted feedback loops so terrifying is how subtly they reshape your identity, making you question your instincts while becoming increasingly dependent on the very source distorting your perception. In a distorted loop, feedback becomes unpredictable. One moment you are praised for something, the next you're criticized for the same behavior. A harmless action is treated as a threat. A genuine concern is dismissed as irrational. These contradictions destabilize your sense of judgment. Your brain searches for patterns but finds none, creating confusion that slowly turns into self-doubt. Over time, you no longer trust your interpretations of events, you trust theirs. Manipulators weaponize this instability by providing feedback that benefits them, not you. They amplify your flaws while minimizing your strengths. They reward compliance and punish independence. They alternate between validation and rejection until you become hooked on the possibility of winning their approval. Every reaction they give becomes a signal you desperately try to decode, not realizing the code itself is designed to keep you unsure. The most chilling part is how quickly distorted feedback loops can erode self-confidence. Little by little, your sense of reality shifts toward their version, leaving you chasing emotional clarity in a maze built from their contradictions, never noticing how deeply your identity has been tethered to their shifting reflections. Selective evidence exposure. Selective evidence exposure is the psychological manipulation that reshapes your beliefs not by changing your mind directly, but by controlling what information you are allowed to see, hear, or even consider. The brain forms its conclusions based on the evidence available, yet it rarely questions whether that evidence has been filtered before it reaches you. When someone curates your reality, showing you only the pieces that support their agenda while hiding anything that contradicts it, your thoughts become anchored to an incomplete picture. The disturbing part is that you feel informed, even confident, while unknowingly standing on a foundation built from half-truths and omissions. When selective evidence exposure takes hold, your perception begins to warp. You start believing patterns that aren't real, threats that aren't present, or promises that were never grounded in truth. The manipulator doesn't need to fabricate lies. They simply feed you the right truths in the right order. You see only positive examples when they want you to trust, only negative ones when they want you to fear, only confirming details when they want you to act. Bit by bit, your mind assembles the limited pieces into a full narrative, unaware that entire sections of the puzzle have been withheld. This tactic becomes especially potent when you're emotionally vulnerable, searching for clarity, or seeking guidance. In those moments, you absorb the curated evidence quickly, grateful for anything that feels like certainty. Soon, your opinions begin to align perfectly with the manipulator's design because they have shaped the raw material from which your conclusions are built. And the most haunting part is that you'll defend those conclusions fiercely, convinced that you arrived at them independently, never realizing that someone decided exactly which truths you were allowed to see. Manufactured certainty. Manufactured certainty is the crafted illusion of confidence used to override a person's doubt, logic, and instincts by presenting a false sense of absolute truth. Humans are naturally drawn to certainty. It soothes anxiety, quiets confusion, and provides a sense of direction when the mind feels overwhelmed. Manipulators weaponize this need by projecting unwavering conviction, speaking boldly, acting decisively, and refusing to acknowledge nuance until their certainty becomes more persuasive than reality itself. The victim doesn't follow because the claim is rational. They follow because the confidence feels safer than their own uncertainty. The insidious power of manufactured certainty comes from how quickly the brain gravitates toward the strongest emotional anchor in a moment of confusion. When someone speaks with forceful assurance, "This is how it is. Trust me. There's no other explanation," the brain interprets their clarity as truth, even when no evidence exists. The manipulator creates a psychological contrast between their unwavering stance and the victim's internal doubt, making the victim feel incompetent for questioning. Slowly, the victim starts deferring to the stronger voice, mistaking authority for accuracy. This manipulation thrives in moments of emotional vulnerability. When a person is scared, stressed, grieving, or unsure, certainty becomes intoxicating. A manipulator will seize this opening, offering absolute answers to complex situations, portraying themselves as the only one who really knows what's going on. The victim, desperate for stability, internalizes the narrative with alarming speed. The most unsettling part is that manufactured certainty doesn't require truth. It only requires confidence, delivered with precision. The victim begins trusting the manipulator's version of reality more than their own perceptions, surrendering judgment to someone whose certainty was never real, only engineered to feel that way. Perception anchoring. Perception anchoring is the unsettling psychological tactic where someone plants a strong initial idea, image, or value in your mind, knowing that everything you encounter afterward will unconsciously be compared to that anchor. The human brain relies on anchors to make sense of the world, using them as reference points for what feels normal, reasonable, or acceptable. When a manipulator controls that first point of reference, they can distort your perception without ever altering the facts themselves. What makes perception anchoring so disturbing is how silently it takes root. The anchor becomes part of your thinking before you even realize it's been placed there. A high price makes a slightly lower one seem fair. A harsh opinion makes a milder one seem gentle. An exaggerated claim makes the truth feel underwhelming. This cognitive distortion turns your judgment into a comparison game, and the anchor always wins. Even when you know the anchor is extreme or misleading, the emotional weight of first impressions is hard to resist. Your brain keeps returning to that initial point, shaping your decisions, expectations, and reactions around it. Manipulators use perception anchoring to steer your choices with precision. They may start with an outrageous demand, so their real request feels reasonable, or present a distorted narrative so their preferred version seems balanced. They can shape how you view a person, a relationship, or even yourself by setting an anchor that defines what normal should look like. The chilling truth is that once an anchor is planted, it doesn't just color your perception. It becomes the lens through which you evaluate every future moment, binding your judgments to someone else's design while making you believe the conclusions were entirely your own. Context removal. Context removal is the psychological distortion where someone strips a situation, statement, or memory of the surrounding details that give it meaning, leaving you with a twisted version of reality that feels true only because the crucial pieces have been erased. Humans rely on context to understand intentions, tone, timing, and emotional nuance. Without it, the mind grasps blindly, filling the empty spaces with assumptions that are often shaped by fear, guilt, or uncertainty. What makes context removal so disturbing is how convincingly it can alter your understanding of events, turning harmless moments into accusations, misunderstandings into guilt, and fragmented truths into powerful weapons. When context is removed, your brain struggles to reconcile what remains. A sentence pulled from a longer conversation suddenly sounds hostile. A single mistake appears monumental when stripped of the circumstances that explain it. A reaction seems unreasonable when the trigger is hidden. The mind tries to make sense of the incomplete puzzle, and in doing so, it often accepts interpretations that feel sharper, darker, and more definitive than the full picture ever would. The emotional impact becomes amplified precisely because your mind is forced to supply the missing information with its own insecurities. Manipulators exploit context removal because it allows them to rewrite events without ever lying outright. They quote selectively, present half-stories, or recall memories in ways that omit the parts that would exonerate you or expose their own motives. They isolate moments until you begin doubting your intentions, apologizing for things you never actually did wrong. The chilling truth is that reality becomes frighteningly easy to distort when the details holding it together are quietly cut away, leaving you defending yourself against a version of events that never truly existed. Sleep cycle disruption. Sleep cycle disruption is the psychological unraveling that occurs when someone interferes with your natural rhythm of rest, leaving your mind exhausted, unbalanced, and dangerously easier to influence. Sleep is the foundation of emotional regulation, memory, judgment, and self-control, and when it's fractured, even slightly, the brain becomes a shadow of itself. What makes this tactic so disturbing is how subtle its effects are. You don't wake up aware that your defenses are lowered. You simply feel off, more irritable, more confused, more sensitive, more desperate for relief, without realizing that your vulnerability is quietly deepening with every lost hour. When your sleep cycle is disrupted, your cognitive abilities weaken. Decisions that were once simple become overwhelming. Your emotions spike unpredictably. Small problems feel catastrophic. A manipulator exploits this state by timing conversations when you're tired, extending conflicts late into the night, creating unpredictable schedules, or provoking just enough stress to fragment your rest. Each missed cycle chips away at your resilience. Each restless night erodes your clarity. Before long, your mind becomes foggy enough that suggestions slip in easier, resistance feels impossible, and tiny pressures feel like immovable walls. This vulnerability intensifies because the effects compound. One night of disrupted sleep makes you fragile. Several nights create a version of you that barely resembles your normal self. Your sense of reality distorts. Your memory blurs. You become more reactive, less analytical, more fearful, and more dependent on the person who seems to offer stability, even if they are the source of the chaos. The haunting truth is that sleep cycle disruption doesn't break you loudly. It breaks you quietly, gradually, invisibly, until you can no longer distinguish fatigue from compliance, confusion from trust, or influence from control. Cognitive fatigue exploitation. Cognitive fatigue exploitation preys on the moment when the mind becomes too tired to defend itself, when thoughts slow, resistance weakens, and the ability to analyze or question starts to collapse under the weight of exhaustion. Mental fatigue doesn't just drain energy, it strips away the very functions that protect a person from manipulation. As the brain tires, it becomes more compliant, more agreeable, and more desperate to end discomfort quickly. A manipulator knows this window well. They wait until the victim is worn down, then push their agenda with quiet confidence, knowing the exhausted mind will grasp for the fastest, easiest sense of relief. When cognitive fatigue sets in, the brain shifts into survival mode. Critical thinking fades, emotional regulation weakens, and decisions become impulsive rather than intentional. The victim may find themselves agreeing to things they don't fully understand, giving answers just to finish the conversation, or accepting claims without scrutiny because the effort of resisting feels unbearable. The manipulator uses this breakdown as a doorway, filling the victim's depleted mental space with suggestions, demands, or emotional narratives timed to hit precisely when the mind is least capable of questioning them. This tactic becomes especially devastating in prolonged arguments, late-night conversations, high-stress environments, or relentless emotional exchanges. Each additional moment of fatigue deepens the vulnerability. The victim stops protecting boundaries and starts seeking peace at any cost, unaware that the peace offered is actually the manipulator's desired outcome. What makes cognitive fatigue exploitation so haunting is its subtlety. The victim doesn't feel controlled. They feel exhausted, relieved to comply, convinced the decision was their own, simply because they no longer had the strength left to resist.